After meeting with Luelon and learning the truth about his hometown, Denken set out to restore his city, resolving to confront the last and strongest of the Sages of Destruction, Macht of the Golden Land. Unaware of these developments, Frieren and her party departed the snowfields of Schmal and soon found themselves seated in a circle. Entering the borders of the Weise region, Frieren sat before a small, humming campfire, and the entire party sat there camping when a small squirrel darted from the undergrowth, scurrying toward Fern with a message secured to its frame. Fern retrieved the note, her movements precise as she called out to Frieren to get her attention. Frieren looked over, wondering aloud if the Continental Magic Association had sent yet another request. Fern scanned the parchment and realized the situation was more specific, explaining that the message was actually a personal request from the first-class mage, Luelon. Frieren considered this, noting that bypassing the official channels of the association usually signaled that a task would be nothing but trouble. She looked at Fern and reasoned that, since it was not an official order, they were technically within their rights to refuse the job. When Fern pointed out her lack of interest, Frieren admitted plainly that she simply hated the man. Stark nodded in silent agreement, recalling how Luelon had once punctured a hole straight through Frieren's shoulder during their previous encounter. However, Fern continued reading, mentioning that a grimoire had been included as a reward for the request. Frieren's demeanor brightened as she declared that they were now having a real conversation, and decided they would take the job after all. Stark sat nearby, looking entirely confused by how quickly the promise of a book had changed her mind. Despite the odd start, the party began their journey toward the specified coordinates. They eventually reached the edge of a high cliff that overlooked the territory ahead. Stark gasped as he took in the view, noting that everything as far as the eye could see was shimmering with a golden light. Frieren gazed down at the fortified city of Weise. She explained that it was an ill-fated place, transmuted instantaneously into gold 50 years ago by the hands of Macht of Dorado, one of the 7 sages of destruction. She had heard rumors that the Continental Magic Association had taken over its governance, noting that the Great Barrier surrounding El Dorado still kept the sage sealed within its walls to this very day. She admitted her surprise, however, that the request to assist the barrier warden had led them to a familiar face. Denken arrived beside the party just then, his presence quiet and heavy. He told them that he had made an earnest plea for this meeting, remarking on the irony of the view. From their vantage point, the cursed city of El Dorado looked undeniably sublime. Stark looked at the older mage, asking if this golden ruin was actually his hometown. Denken clarified that it wasn't exactly his birthplace. He explained that the fortified city of Weise had been governed by the family of his stepfather, the feudal Lord Gluck. His actual hometown was Fothernot, a village located at the northern end of the region where he had once lived in a mansion with his wife. He revealed that the village had only been swallowed by the expanding gold of El Dorado a few years ago. Fern caught the detail immediately and asked for clarification. She noted that according to Luelon's request, El Dorado and Macht had been sealed 50 years prior. Denken explained the grim reality of the magic, stating that while the barrier was intended solely to seal Macht away, the transmutation of El Dorado itself continued to gradually expand. This was why a warden was required every year to readjust the range of the barrier and keep the gold contained. Fern gathered that this was how the association maintained control. She observed that leaving Macht alone didn't seem like something Ciri would usually do, yet she admitted it was an excellent decision. Frieren suspected that she would likely have made the same choice in that position. Denken then shared that, as the warden, he was granted passage through the Great Barrier, which had allowed him to enter El Dorado and finally visit his wife's grave in his home village. Fern asked him simply if he had found contentment in that visit. Denken paused, the silence stretching between them for a moment. Frieren watched him closely before issuing a stern warning. She told him that if he intended to fight Macht, her party would not offer any assistance. She pointed toward Fern and remarked that this truly was the trouble she had sensed earlier. She told Fern to send the grimoire back, stating they would not be accepting the request. Fern realized there was more to Frieren's hesitance. Frieren looked at her companions and admitted that in the past she had once been defeated by Macht of El Dorado. The party fell into a shocked silence. Frieren explained that Macht was one of the few mages she had lost to throughout her long life, much like her encounter with Qual. She confessed that even now she could not picture a path to victory against him. She reasoned that if they truly wanted him defeated, it was better to leave him sealed for a century, or even a millennium, until he eventually perished of old age. She suspected that Ciri had the same intention, Denken interrupted, conceding that Frieren was right. He admitted that he had initially thought sealing him was enough, but he described himself as a far more heartless man than they might think. He explained that after his wife passed when he was young, he had never once returned to his hometown. He confessed he wasn't the sort of admirable man who faithfully visited a grave, despite constantly telling himself that he would return one day. He had used his work and status as excuses to stay away, realizing eventually that he likely feared reminiscing over the blissful moments he had once shared with his wife. When he heard from an old friend that the village had finally been swallowed by the gold, he had made the final decision to return. He expected that the memories of his life there would be gone, and he had planned to peacefully embrace the end of his days after seeing the destruction for himself. However, when he arrived and saw the familiar chairs and buildings, now frozen in gold, his memories returned with sudden, overwhelming clarity. Absolutely nothing had changed. The gold had preserved the setting of his happiest years. He recalled walking into the church and looking at the altar, picturing his wedding day and the happiness on his wife's face. He realized then that those euphoric times were real, regardless of how much time had passed or how stressful his life had become. As Denken spoke, Frieren found herself pulled into her own memories of the hero party. She remembered a moment with Himmel, Eisen, and Heider. She had been speaking to Himmel, remarking on how strange it was that he wanted to see her flowerbed spell. Himmel had looked at her with a smile, telling Frieren that she surprised him, as he hadn't expected her to make such a look. Frieren had told Himmel that the spell she was using was one her long-deceased master, Flamma, had adored. She explained that she usually avoided using it because it reminded her of her master, yet she felt miraculously calm in that moment. Himmel had told her that while he didn't know the full extent of the difficult and painful journey she had led until then, he was sure that the time she spent with her master was nothing but idyllic. He told her it was all right to remember those times. Returning to the present, Denken apologized to Frieren for taking up their time. He told her she didn't need to accept the request, suggesting Luelon had only sent it out of needless concern. He turned to walk away, stating he planned to fight Macht alone and believed he had gathered enough information to secure a slim chance of victory. He insisted he would not be reckless, but he wanted to see the radiant landscape of his hometown restored before he died. Suddenly, Frieren spoke up, surprising him by stating she would help him after all. She looked at Denken and smiled, explaining that they would assist in securing that chance of victory. She noted that turning tail and fleeing was a strategy they didn't necessarily need to use just yet. They arrived at a modest cabin. Denken explained that the structure had been specifically prepared for the barrier warden, though he noted that there was practically no one eccentric enough to actually stay in such a place. As they moved inside, Denken clarified that wardens throughout the ages would typically only visit when it was time to adjust the barrier, promptly taking their leave once the task was complete. Freeren looked around the interior. She noted that although the barrier kept the sage in check, the cabin was far too close to Dorado for comfort. She turned her gaze toward Fern and Stark, remarking that any mage would feel an inherent lack of ease in this location. Fern indeed looked physically uncomfortable. Stark leaned in toward Fern, asking if she was feeling all right since she had looked pale ever since they first gazed upon Dorado. Fern insisted she was fine, but Denken offered a sincere apology, admitting he had not been considerate enough. He explained that those unfamiliar with the region would find the proximity to Dorado to be extremely uncanny. Stark, feeling no such weight, asked what Denken meant. Frieren explained that Stark was perfectly fine, observing that it was in times like these when warriors were most reassuring to have around. Stark wondered if the sensation was something only mages could understand, suspecting it was mana emanating from the city. He asked if the mage within was enacting some sort of insane mana. Fern corrected him, explaining that the situation was quite the opposite. She could not sense even the slightest hint of mana from the city. She reasoned that regardless of how powerful a barrier might be, a spell capable of magically transmuting such a vast area into gold should be detectable even from their current distance. Fern fathomed that her mana detection was telling her something strange. Dorado did not seem to be a region transmuted by magic, but rather an enormous mass of solid gold in its purest form. Freeren agreed, recognizing that Fern's perception of the area was in fact correct. Frieren moved closer to Fern, noting how ominous it was that such powerful magic could remain entirely imperceptible. She explained that Macht's magic, Dia Golze, was a universal golden transmutation magic. She described it as a curse magic that transformed everything in the material world into gold. Stark recalled that curses were generally considered magic of an obscure nature used by demons and monsters. Denken provided a more technical explanation, noting that curse was the common term used to denote magic that specifically sedated, petrified, or transformed the state of matter. Stark wondered if a priest's magic or the power of the goddess could dispel it, but Denken clarified that such a solution only applied to ordinary curses. Freeren continued the explanation, noting that after the era of never-ending war with the Demon King's army, countless heroes had been transmuted into gold by Macht across the northern countries. To this day, they all remained as gold statues. She stated that not a single one of them could be saved, as Dia Golze cannot be dispelled even with the magic of the goddess. She recognized it as the ultimate curse. Since it was imperceptible as magic, it could not be obstructed with defense magic, and evasion was not an option. This was why Macht of Dorado was considered the most powerful of the 7 sages of destruction. Frieren admitted that she could not imagine any prospect of victory, which was why she felt they needed the assistance of Serie. Denken asked for the chance to explain the entire story, including that matter. He revealed that he had received intelligence from his partner, the second-class mage Aureole, who had provided him with certain memories. As he began to elaborate, Frieren cut him short, suggesting he should simply get to the conclusion because he was talking a lot. Denken appeared a bit uncomfortable at the remark, and the scene shifted away to a carriage on the road to Albers. Inside the carriage, Luelon spoke to Aureole, acknowledging the great endeavor she had undertaken. He noted they would arrive at their destination in just a few days. Aureole sighed, remarking that she felt like she had been in hell during the investigation of Dorado. Luelon explained that her efforts had allowed them to provide Denken with valuable intelligence in exchange for helping him save his hometown. Aureole observed that Luelon seemed to support Denken quite a bit and asked him why. Luelon paused before explaining that they had been friends for a long time. He recalled being an imperial mage in his youth when he and Denken were colleagues. Though Denken came from the imperial army and was a typical noble, they had strangely gotten along well. Luelon noted that despite Denken's talent, navigating the social world was not one of his strong points. Luelon remembered being expelled from his position early on, and recalled that only Denken had defended him until the very end. At that time, Luelon had sworn that he would one day repay that gratitude. He described Denken as a young man who possessed a sort of zeal that others lacked. He also noted that Denken was an extremely devoted husband. Luelon recalled listening to Denken speak fondly of his wife with a forced smile, hearing the same memories and plans to return home over and over. Luelon felt a sense of nostalgia, noting that Denken practically never talked about such things anymore. Ultimately, Denken had stayed away from his hometown for over half a century. But Luelon understood that facing something one has been parted from for so long required an extraordinary amount of courage. When the village was finally engulfed by Dorado a few years prior, Denken had finally taken action. Luelon expressed his desire to help his friend return, not to the frigid, adamantine Dorado, but to the radiant hometown he once knew. Aureole listened intently to these memories, but remarked that it felt like the decision had come too far in the future. Luelon agreed it was late, yet he could not fault him. He observed that as humans with limited lifespans, people often live as if one day is a time that will always exist. Luelon realized that both he and Denken had failed to grasp such a simple concept until they grew old. He admitted that he, too, had been putting off his payments of gratitude to Denken, thinking he could lend a hand whenever he was in trouble. With the final farewell approaching, he saw this as the only opportunity left. He had put all his efforts into assisting Denken now, granting him the honor of trying to save his land. Luelon viewed this as the final struggle of a feeble old man, wondering what Denken would think when he saw his hometown turn to gold. He felt certain that Denken would show them a magnificent final struggle that he himself could never fathom. The scene returned to the cabin where Denken sat with Frieren and her party. Denken stated his conclusion plainly. It was impossible to defeat Macht. Frieren reacted immediately, suggesting that the case was closed and they should move on. Our boy Stark interjected, telling her that they should listen to the whole explanation first, noting that she had drawn her conclusion far too quickly. Inside the cabin, a heavy silence followed Denken's grim declaration. It was Denken who eventually broke it, clarifying that while it was indeed impossible to defeat Macht, it had now become possible that they might not lose. He stood there, the weight of his age apparent in his posture, as he reasoned that they needed to find out exactly what their prospects of success were, based on the intelligence gathered thus far. Frieren paused, her expression shifting as she asked for clarification on what he meant by not losing. Denken looked at her, noting that since she had fought against Macht before, she must be curious about why he was still standing there alive. Freeren began to respond, but Fern joined in, wondering what the older mage was implying. Denken continued. He described how he had entered El Dorado and visited his wife's gravesite in their home village. Frieren noted that Macht's mana detection reached throughout the entirety of the city and was extremely precise, so much so that even she would find it difficult to deceive. Denken nodded, confirming that Macht had certainly found him. His memory drifted back to the quiet gravesite where Macht had arrived, sitting calmly on the ground. Denken recalled glaring at the sage with one eye as the demon simply watched him. He explained that the demon had allowed him to leave, leading him to believe that Macht had no intention of killing him at that very moment. Frieren found this to be a bold assertion, remarking that it was almost as if Denken resonated with the demon. Denken agreed that there were complicated circumstances involved and offered to go over the entire story, starting with the current condition of El Dorado and Macht. He explained that the Continental Magic Association had been established at the time the city of Weise was sealed alongside Macht's half-darkness. He noted that while the barrier was a good start, the association had been half-hearted, doing nothing but maintaining the seal. This was why Luelon had launched his own investigation, using the memories of the second-class mage Aureole to reach his conclusions. The shared memory then shifted to a different space, the city of magic, Aureole, in the northern lands. Within the memory, Kana and Luelon were seen in a pastry shop, holding carefully crafted treats. Aureole approached them, commenting on how nice the pastries looked. Kana agreed enthusiastically, explaining that they were new creations. She had chosen a cat-shaped one, while Luelon had picked a rabbit. Luelon chowed down on her treat, declaring it delicious, which seemed to annoy Khan since her friend had started eating before her. Aureole waved them off, before heading inside to get her own. Inside the shop, Aureole found herself surrounded by an array of pastries, even spotting some shaped like bears. As she struggled to make a choice, Luelon walked into the scene and stepped up to the counter, asking for one of each of the 3 new creations. Aureole was surprised by his presence, her attention snapping toward the first-class mage. But then, Stark interrupted the story, asking if there was truly a need to discuss the pastry shop. Frieren explained that the transference of memories is an advanced magic, and it is often difficult to demarcate where a significant event begins. The magic tended to start from whatever scene left an impression on the person. Denken continued the narrative. After Luelon and Aureole met in the shop, they stepped outside with their purchases. Luelon handed over the bag of pastries that he got to Aureole, which prompted her to ask if he was sure about the gesture. Luelon replied that it was nothing special compared to the remuneration he would be paying her head family. Aureole, appreciative of the gift, asked if this was another job for the Continental Magic Association. Luelon clarified that it was more of a personal request. He explained that among the current first-class mages, there was no expert in mental magic as extraordinary as she was, which was why he needed her. When Aureole mentioned the mysterious mage method, Luelon encountered that he didn't consider method to be a true expert in this specific field. Aureole remarked that Luelon must be having a hard time, but he simply turned to walk off, stating that he found it quite enjoyable and admitted he was likely the least upright among them. As they walked, Aureole asked about the specifics of the request. Luelon revealed it involved El Dorado. Aureole questioned what she could even do, noting that her hypnosis magic was useless if not used on other people or creatures with human-like intellects. She explained that demons possessed a completely different mental construction, making it impossible to sympathize with or grasp their minds. Luelon agreed, but explained that this was not her intended role. They arrived at a location where a bracelet sat atop a pillar. He identified it as the Stone Bracelet of Sovereignty, a replica of a magical item crafted by Sage Erwig during the mythical era. He explained it was the only item in existence capable of controlling a demon's mind. He told Aureole that the Lord of Weise had once used the original bracelet to control Macht and gain unfathomable riches, though Macht had eventually rebelled and transmuted the city into gold. Luelon suspected that the original bracelet had malfunctioned. He handed the replica to Aureole. He tasked her with deciphering them, believing the bracelet was the key to taking down the sage. Aureole realized the pressure he was putting on her, asking what he would do if she failed. Lernen simply replied that he had lived this long because he always knew when to back off. The memory shifted again to the carriage moving toward the Golden City. Lernen told Edel that they would arrive soon, noting that colleagues had gone ahead for a preliminary examination. When Edel asked if they would be all right, Lernen mentioned that the group was being led by the first-class mage Tao. He described Tao as a young but elite first-class mage with plenty of combat experience. He was sure they would return with meaningful intelligence. However, as they moved through the forest, they spotted an injured woman. It was the second-class mage, Frieren. Frieren collapsed to the ground, calling his name. He urged her to report, and she revealed through labored breaths that they had encountered Macht within El Dorado. She explained that Macht had laid waste to all of them in the blink of an eye. Without a second to even cast magic, their comrades had been massacred. Lernen was stunned by the speed of the attack and asked why she was still alive. When she said she had escaped in desperation, Lernen rephrased his question, asking why Macht had allowed her to leave. Before she could answer, she realized her hand was turning to gold. Edel rushed towards her as Lernen asked her to quickly read through her memories. Edel reached out, but it was already too late. Frieren had been completely transmuted into solid gold. Lernen apologized to the now gold statue of Frieren for the duty he had forced upon her. He sensed that letting her go was intended to be a warning for them. He grew anxious as he realized that it seems that they underestimated Macht, and admitted he was now looking forward to entering El Dorado. Lernen and Edel stood together near the shimmering entrance of the Golden City. Edel observed that the barrier had a powerful perception prevention magic cast upon it, noting that ordinary people wouldn't even be able to see El Dorado. Lernen explained that the magic was necessary because the city was blatantly conspicuous and always stimulated human greed. He mentioned that while the surrounding villages had evacuated long ago and few today remembered the fortified city of Weise, there were still those who desired to take home the gold. He noted that these people often penetrated the perception prevention magic, though practically none of them ever returned alive. Lernen clarified that the Great Barrier of El Dorado was strictly designed to ward off demons, meaning it could not stop humans from breaching it or protect those reckless enough to enter. He bent down and picked a golden apple from the ground, remarking that if the gold found here were to be circulated, it would bring about a great disaster. He handed the heavy, metallic fruit to Edel, explaining that the one saving grace was that there was a way to distinguish this gold from the real thing. As she held the apple, Edel gathered that the gold Macht created with magic was indestructible. Lernen confirmed this, explaining that no matter how much heat or power was applied, the gold would never change its shape. He added that while magic analysis would identify it as gold, it would be recognized as an entirely different material. With that understanding, they left the immediate area and headed deeper into the forest toward the city. Lernen mentioned that there was one person he wanted her to see before they entered El Dorado proper. They arrived at a house where an old man lay in bed, looking dazed. Lernen explained that he was a servant who had served the family of Gluck, the feudal lord of Weise. On the day the city was transmuted, he had been sent on an errand to a neighboring town and was thus spared, making him one of the very few survivors. While he wasn't directly involved in the incidents, Lernen believed he might offer clues to help them understand Macht. He noted that the man's memories had become obscure due to age, which is why he needed Edel to read them. The old man raised a trembling hand and begged Edel to help save the fortified city of Weise. She reached for his hand and asked how long he had worked as a servant. He replied that it had been 20 years. Edel turned to Lernen, noting that 60 years of memories was simply too much information to process, and asked if they could narrow it down. Lernen suggested focusing on the scene 60 years ago, when the feudal lord used the stone bracelet of sovereignty on Macht. Edel grasped the man's hand and began to navigate his past. Within the memories, Edel witnessed Macht bending over before the leader of the city. She watched as the feudal lord commanded Macht to serve the people of Weise and all their descendants. He further ordered the demon never to commit any malicious acts toward the people of Weise, stating that the instant he bore even the slightest malice, he was to sever his own life. Macht knelt there, as though he accepted the terms. Back in the present, Edel let go of the man's hand, looking visibly uncomfortable. She told Lernen that the Lord had ordered Macht to never bear malice, noting that it was not a precise command, but a general order to never commit a malicious act. Lernen appeared uneasy at this revelation. When the old man asked what the issue was, Edel explained that there wouldn't be an issue at all if their enemy wasn't a demon. She walked out, telling Lernan they should head to El Dorado, as their plans might need to change depending on the circumstances. Before leaving, she asked the old man why the Lord had manipulated Macht in the first place. The servant replied that he heard it was to gain unfathomable riches. Edel did not respond and simply walked out, stating she now had a clear picture. As they approached the bridge of the barrier, the trees began to look different, signaling they were entering a new domain. Lernan warned that if they let their guards down, they would lose their lives. Edel asked if he found the situation peculiar. Lernan remarked that there were so many peculiarities, he wasn't sure which one she meant. Edel pointed out the claim that the Lord manipulated Macht for riches. She reasoned that gold that cannot be refined would easily be exposed. She explained that gold has universal value because it can be melted down and repurposed even if a country collapses. Because Macht's gold was indestructible and could not be handled or refined, it possessed no real value. She looked at the golden apple, noting that an imitation would always remain an imitation. She deduced that there were circumstances involved beyond their understanding. They finally crossed into the Golden City, where they were met with a horrendous sight. Spears of gold had pierced through several men, who were frozen in their final moments. Edul couldn't believe her eyes, and Lernan remarked on the horrific scene, identifying the bodies as his previous collaborators and a group of treasure-hunting adventurers. As they moved forward, Lernan suddenly called out to Edel, and she signaled that she had sensed it too. In that moment, they realized Macht was standing right behind them. They turned slowly. Lernan admitted that the situation had gone south, noting that despite both of them being experts at concealment, the demon had found them. Macht spoke to them, stating they could have turned back, but now he would need to decorate the city with 2 new corpses. Lernan noted that the demon seemed rather languid. Macht replied that he did not particularly enjoy conflict, which is why intruders are brutally exterminated and then transmuted into gold. He believed that only then would others finally retreat. The demon placed a hand on the ground and pulled his coat aside, taking a low stance. With a swift movement, he turned the fabric of his coat into a solid, sharp sword. He remarked that daredevils like them were the ones who disturbed the peace. Before he could strike, Lernan raised his staff and blasted him with magic. As the dust settled, it was clear Macht had used his sword to parry the attack. Lernan smiled, telling the demon he was honored to be called a daredevil, noting it was the most remarkable praise he had ever received. Lernan was clearly relishing the chance for a high-level duel. The dust from the initial explosion began to settle, revealing Macht standing amidst the shimmering golden ruins. Recognizing the opening, Lernan called out to Edel. She responded instantly, placing her hand firmly against the ground to establish a connection. In that moment, she sought to anchor her magic to the stone bracelet of sovereignty, still fastened to Macht's wrist. When Lernan asked how much time the task would require, she explained that it would depend entirely on the complexity of the restoration. Lernan looked at the demon, remarking that since there was a chance of a drawn-out battle, he was quite eager to put his skills to the test. Suddenly, Macht vanished from his position. Before Lernan could react, the demon appeared directly in front of him, his hand reaching out to grab Lernan by the collar. With a sharp whoosh of air, Lernan managed to escape the physical grasp, floating high into the air above the sage. He followed up immediately with a barrage of Zoltraaks, but Macht took to the air as well. The demon swung his sword with a heavy, weighted movement, which Lernan barely managed to intercept with a glowing magic shield. While they clashed in the air, Lernan maintained a calm exterior. He realized that Macht was not attempting to transform him into gold immediately. Instead, the demon was focused solely on a physical kill to make an example of him. This realization sparked a cold anger in Lernan, who gathered that the demon was making light of his abilities. He unleashed a second, more aggressive volley of attacks at the sage. The battle turned into a series of makeshift skirmishes used primarily to stall for time. As the dust from another heavy exchange settled, Macht used the fabric of his clothes to absorb and block all of the attacks. The demon looked at Lernan, recognizing that while the man was a tough opponent, he lacked a specific killing intent. Dashing forward once more, Macht swung his blade and told Lernan he must have another motive for this fight. Lernan met the heavy swing with a massive shield, the impact forcing him back toward the ground. Lernan looked up from the earth as Macht observed that they were clearly attempting to restore the stone bracelet. The demon stated plainly that such efforts were futile. Nearby, Edel looked increasingly uncomfortable, calling out to Luelon with bad news. Luelon admitted he wasn't particularly tempted to hear it, but Edel pressed on. She revealed that the stone bracelet of sovereignty was already working exactly as intended. She sensed that the hypnosis magic cast upon Macht had never actually lost its effect. Luelon was puzzled, reasoning that if the magic was active, it meant Macht bore no malice toward the people of Weise. Yet the reality remained that the entire city and its inhabitants had been transmuted into gold. It was hard for him to fathom that such an act could be committed without the slightest hint of malice. When he asked for her perspective, Macht interrupted. The demon explained that while they were aware of the word malice, demons possess no such notion. He stated that they do not feel malice, and therefore cannot bear a feeling that does not even exist within them. Edel recognized the grim nature of the situation. She noted that demons are defined as monsters who deceive and prey on humans as a part of their natural lifestyle. To a demon, harming people was a trait they were born with, requiring no specific reason or emotional drive. She reasoned that for them, it was likely akin to the basic human acts of eating or sleeping, actions performed with practically zero consideration or emotional weight. Luelon understood that they were at a significant loss. He asked if she could place an additional command on the bracelet, but Edel clarified that only the original user possessed that power. Macht looked at them, asking if they had determined their next course of action. Luelon admitted that he had chosen to retreat, stating his prime objective was strictly to gather information. He noted that while there was some consideration about whether they might be fortunate enough to defeat the demon, he recognized it was a bad idea to be quixotic. By his own admission, Luelon was a cowardly man who preferred working from the shadows. He produced a glass bottle containing a small creature, declaring that he would leave the honor of victory to a brave old friend while he focused on intelligence. He dropped the bottle, and as it shattered, a massive, golem-like creature erupted from the shards. Holding on to Edel, Luelon noted that since neither of them had fully revealed their hand, they should consider this a fresh start. He promised to return as many times as needed to expose the demon's entire arsenal. Macht admitted he was at a loss for words. With a single, fluid swing of his sword, he cut the golem in half and delivered a deep slash across Luelon's chest. Luelon gasped, but managed to tell the demon that he had been under the wrong impression the entire time. In a sudden shift, Edel appeared directly behind Macht, placing her hand upon Macht's rear. Luelon remarked that while Edel might not be as powerful, she was a far braver mage than he. Macht's gaze slowly followed her movement, but before he could strike her, a second golem appeared, snatching Edel away from the demon. Macht palmed his face in genuine annoyance, recognizing that Edel had successfully read his memories during the encounter. Luelon stood his ground, though blood flowed from the wound on his chest. He told Macht there was no longer a need to return, and produced an even larger bottle. Luelon praised Edel for her marvelous work, declaring they had acquired sufficient intelligence. He dropped the large bottle, summoning a ginormous golem that resembled a massive knight. The golem swung its sword, triggering a gargantuan explosion that rocked the Golden City. When the dust finally cleared, Macht was seen graciously holding the golem's sword, having already converted the entire massive construct into gold. Looking around, he found that Luelon and Edel had vanished. The scene shifted back to the present, inside the quiet cabin where Denken was finishing his story. Freeren understood the gravity of the feat, noting that because demon minds are built so differently, reaching into one to harness memories is a near impossible act that must have caused Edel unbelievable torment. Denken observed the sunset, noting it was almost time to finish his daily business. When Frieren asked what he meant, Denken revealed that he traveled into El Dorado every single day to engage in talks. Freeren was shocked, asking who he could possibly be talking to. Denken told her that he had been speaking with Macht of El Dorado. He admitted that talking to a demon was, in many ways, a complete waste of time, yet it was the only way he could continue grasping at straws. Frieren finally voiced the question weighing on everyone's mind, asking Denken what he meant by engaging in talks with Macht. Denken clarified that this entire region, including his own village, was the territory of the Gluck family, the feudal lords of Weise. He noted that he was a citizen of Weise himself, though the city was not populous. Frieren considered this, remembering that there were two distinct commands issued by the stone bracelet of sovereignty, to serve the citizens of Weise and to never bear any malice toward them. Frieren reasoned that even if Macht saw no meaning in the word malice, the command to serve likely still held effect. She realized that this was why Denken could safely enter El Dorado. She suspected that Macht might actually be listening to Denken's commands. Stark wondered if that was the reason for the ongoing talks, but Frieren cautioned that the situation might not be so favorable. She noted that if it were that simple, everything could be resolved by Denken simply ordering Macht to die. Denken agreed, explaining that while the demon would not cause him harm, he would not accept forceful commands either. He observed that demons are innately asocial beings, and the very concept of servitude remains ambiguous to them. Frieren questioned why Denken persisted with such foolish behavior, noting that depending on Macht's understanding of servitude, Denken could be killed at any moment. Denken admitted he was grasping at straws, but explained that his ultimate goal was to return El Dorado to normal. He understood that even if they defeated Macht, the city might not revert to its original state. Frieren recognized the problem, noting how troublesome the mechanics of magic could be. She explained to a confused Stark that after a caster's death, the magic's survival depends on the qualities of the spell itself. While some magic fades, others, like the barriers erected by the great mage Flamma, linger for centuries. She suspected that Diagolze was a magic that remained after death. Denken confirmed this, realizing that killing Macht might be useless if it didn't break the curse. Macht himself understood the value of his own life in this regard, creating a situation that felt like a hostage crisis. Despite knowing the talks were likely futile, Denken prepared to head out again. Freeren asked to join him, prompting Stark to ask if it was safe. Denken noted that while Macht likely wouldn't lay a hand on them if introduced as friends, he couldn't guarantee their safety. Frieren insisted, arguing that seeking a way to defeat him was more practical than pointless talk. Denken saw the reason in her words and agreed to let them accompany him. Frieren told Fern and Stark to wait behind, but Fern insisted on going. She noticed Stark's hands were shaking like crazy, but he smiled, expressing confidence in his ability to flee and carry them both if push came to shove. Frieren smiled back, assuring them she was only going to talk and didn't plan on anything happening. As they walked through the forest, Frieren apologized to them in advance, telling them not to get angry, which left her companions confused. They arrived at the gates of the Golden City, where Macht stood as if waiting for them. Denken introduced his friends and told Macht to treat them kindly. Looking at Frieren, the demon claimed it was their first meeting, identifying himself as the magic instructor of the Gluck family. Frieren looked up at him and corrected him, stating they had fought 6 centuries ago, asking if she should help him remember their friendship. Suddenly, Fern and Stark took fighting stances, and Frieren's provocative tone surprised the demon. Denken quickly stepped in, commanding them to stop and reminding them they were there to talk. Macht offered a polite apology for the tension. The scene shifted to a calm sitting room, where they all sat with coffee. Macht invited them to help themselves before it turned cold, noting he had kept the tea utensils intact because Lord Gluck had a fondness for them. Stark and Fern whispered to Frieren, accusing her of trying to ignite a flame and complaining about the stress on their hearts. Frieren reminded them she had told them not to get angry, explaining she merely wanted to confirm something. Macht found this intriguing and asked what she had discovered. Frieren looked him in the eye and stated that while they could not defeat him, she now knew he was not flawless. Macht asked Denken who the girl was. Upon realizing she was the mage of the hero party, he smiled, noting it felt truly nostalgic as Denken often shared tales of their exploits. Frieren asked if he had ever considered taking revenge for the Demon King, but Macht smiled and sipped his tea, admitting he genuinely did not care. He explained that he bore no allegiance to the Demon King and actually despised conflict, wishing only to live in peace. He claimed to have been a pacifist even within the Demon King's army, seeking a path for coexistence. Frieren dismissed this as a typical demon lie, but Macht insisted he was telling the truth. He pointed out that Denken had seen his true feelings through Edel's memory reading. Denken confirmed that Macht truly wished to coexist, but Frieren found the desire pointless. She pointed out that despite his words, he refused to return the city to normal, and continued to kill all intruders. She asked why he kept killing if he truly wanted peace. Macht responded by asking her why she would even ask such a thing. In that moment, Frieren recognized that the conversation really was a waste of time. She fathomed that demons were hopelessly different from people, unable to even grasp her annoyance. Realizing they would never reach an understanding, Denken suggested they end the meeting for the day. As they walked back toward the cabin, Frieren asked Denken about his relationship with Macht. Denken revealed that Macht was not only the exclusive mage of the Gluck family, but had also been his master while he was growing up. The group returned to the quiet interior of the cabin, the weight of their recent encounter still hanging in the air. He began to recount the stories of his past, explaining how the demon had taught him many a spell from the time he was just an infant. He noted that Macht was strangely capable of casting various non-demon spells, a trait that had shaped Denken's own magical foundation. Frieren paused, her eyes narrowing as she processed the timeline. Duncan revealed that he was 78, but she questioned his age, realizing that if he was 78, the years did not quite add up. She reminded him that Macht had been equipped with the stone bracelet of sovereignty only 60 years ago. Denken grew quiet before explaining that Macht had actually begun serving Gluck, the feudal lord of Weise, at least 80 years ago. The bracelet was a safeguard added 20 years later. He clarified that the transition was not due to any fault of Macht's, but rather the result of serious political issues of the time. Turning toward the window, Denken spoke of the past with a certain gravity. He described how Macht had been friendly even before the bracelet was forced upon him, never once disobeying Gluck's orders. Denken admitted that he once thought a safeguard like the bracelet was entirely unnecessary. He recognized it as an uncanny situation, as Weise had once been a place where coexistence with a demon felt truly possible. Freeren listened with quiet surprise. Denken eventually asked if she had discovered any prospects of victory during their talk. Sadly, Frieren reached the same verdict as Denken, stating that they could not defeat Macht at this time. She noted that it wouldn't have been unusual if he had transmuted them all to gold during the conversation. Denken observed that she had still tried to pick a fight in a dramatic way, and sensed that she was hiding something. Frieren denied keeping secrets, explaining that as she was not a demon, she simply lacked confidence. She reasoned that prospects of victory always consisted of too many unknown variables. She then turned the question back to him, asking if he had grasped any prospects from the memories Adel had retrieved. Denken confessed that he had not finished analyzing them. He explained that there was a plethora of data, as the memories Adel read covered up to 100 years. Freeren was impressed, recognizing Adel as an exceptional master of mental magic for gathering a century's worth of life through a single touch. She offered to assist with the analysis. When Stark questioned if such a thing was possible, Frieren took Denken's hand. She explained that while she wasn't particularly strong in mental magic, she could share and analyze his memories if he assisted her. Denken thanked her, admitting he owed her for the help. As they held hands, a blinding light began to emanate, marking their descent into the thoughts of the past to find a way to defeat the sage. Meanwhile, back in the Golden City, Macht sat alone in contemplation. He mused to himself that their talk had been truly meaningful. He pondered the question Frieren had asked, why he continued to kill, despite his wish for coexistence. He found it to be a brilliant question, realizing that understanding the difference in their sensibilities was exactly what guided his pursuit of coexistence. He smiled, sensing that his memories were likely being transferred to Frieren through Denken at that very moment. He welcomed it, thinking that she should feel free to look through his life and eventually engage in a battle for the sake of that very coexistence. He hoped she might find the answers he had been seeking. Deep within the mental landscape, the memories began to play. Just another everyday scene from a long life. Macht remembered everything with a strange, sharp clarity. He recalled laying waste to a human village upon the orders of the Great Demon King. It was just one of many settlements he had destroyed. Houses burned, and the air was thick with the scent of ruin. He had arrived at a church that was already being consumed by fire. Inside, the priests rambled on, using words like malice and guilt, words Macht had heard countless times from people on the verge of death. The priest looked up at him, searching for a flicker of emotion that might stop the madness. Macht asked why the man had gone silent, and if he intended to stop pleading for his life. The priest exhaled, realizing that Macht simply did not understand. He spoke with a pitying tone, calling the situation shocking and the demon himself pitiful. These words provoked a rare surge of rage in Macht. With a swift, heavy swing of his blade, he sliced the priest in half. Macht found himself filled with doubts. He knew the words, but he did not know the feelings behind them. He walked out of the church into the mayhem, reflecting on what he understood. He knew fear, rage, and even sorrow, but malice and guilt remained foreign. He encountered a knight who stood bravely despite the blood on his face. He could see the knight's desire to kill him, a reaction derived from anger and hatred. Macht concluded that such emotions were futile, as a single swing of his sword sent the knight to the ground. He understood these common feelings, but the deeper concepts of human morality eluded him. For the first time, he possessed a genuine interest in people. He arrived at a space where two young boys were huddled, paralyzed by terror. He pulled out 2 daggers and placed them in front of the children. He told them to battle, promising that only the survivor would live. He watched them with a detached curiosity, wanting to see what these life-and-death emotions meant to them. In his own way, he considered this to be a favor. He concluded that he had actually come to like people as he watched them turn on one another. The scene shifted to the remains of yet another town, where Macht stood amidst the silence of a completed massacre and the still forms of villagers scattered across the estate. Macht stood over one of the bodies, reflecting on the void within himself. He mused that not a single emotion was coming to him, wondering if the feelings he sought were simply beyond his comprehension. He came to a halt, sensing a presence behind him. He asked who was there, noting that if they were waiting for an opening, it was a futile act. The figure revealed himself as Warheit, introducing himself as one of the 3 great knights of the northern countries. Macht remarked that he must have stayed in this region for far too long, if mankind was already sending out reckless troublemakers. He told the knight not to worry, as he had already planned to leave the land. Even as he spoke, Warheit moved, firing an arrow that whistled through the air. This guy was not here for talk. Macht deflected the projectile with his sword, as the knight declared that he could not allow the demon to leave. Warheit leapt high into the air before he unleashed a barrage of arrows downward. Macht moved with fluid, weightless grace, weaving between the whistling shafts. The knight observed that Macht had not yet transmuted this particular village into gold. Macht calmly asked what the point of such a statement was. Warheit explained that since not every settlement Macht raided was turned to gold, he had deduced that certain complex conditions had to be fulfilled for the magic to activate. The warrior continued his assault, firing arrow after arrow. Warheit vowed that he would not permit the demon the opportunity to fulfill those conditions here. These words caused a thin smile to play on Macht's lips. He stopped moving and took a relaxed stance, prompting Warheit to ask what was the matter. Macht asked what the man meant by activation conditions, wondering if humans truly pondered such intricacies when using magic. As the warrior looked on, confused and taken aback, Macht asked if people pondered how to move every individual limb whenever they chose to use them. He provided the answer himself, stating that it was all done merely on a whim. He explained that his magic involved no activation conditions. If he chose to get serious, he could end any battle in an instant. In that very moment, the gray hue of gold began to creep up Warheit's legs. The knight didn't even realize it until he found his body refused to move. With his last breath, he asked a final, desperate question. Then why? Before Macht could respond, Warheit had been fully claimed by the gold, becoming a frozen monument of his own bravery. Macht walked up to the statue and patted the cold, metallic shoulder. He answered the silent question, explaining that he hadn't transmuted everything from the start, simply because it was mundane to do so. He remarked that all the skills and bravery the knight had tempered to his day were meaningless before his magic. He asked the lifeless man if such a one-sided affair could even be called a battle, concluding that it was just fun. As he walked away, he noted that he actually found these kinds of battles distasteful. The scene then transitioned to a desolate shoreline near the open ocean. Macht arrived at the water's edge and found another demon standing near a dolphin that had lost its way and washed onto the land. Macht addressed the demon, noting he had heard of eccentric demons who researched mankind, and asked if she was one of them. The demon, Zoltraak, turned and smiled. She spoke of the vastness of the world, noting how the sea held so many species and how the land and water existed in a delicate balance. She remarked that if the world were pushed far enough, the people on land could not survive. Macht looked at the sea, surprised by the existence of such enormous fish. Zoltraak agreed. She guided Macht away from the shore and toward her dwelling, a repurposed ship hangar that humans had used in the past. Inside, the hangar was filled with the quiet atmosphere of a museum. Macht walked forward and asked about the various skeletal specimens on display. Zoltraak explained they were creatures from the sea. Zoltraak pointed out that the skeletons looked completely different. She asked if he knew the term convergent evolution, to which he admitted he did not. She explained that the Great Demon King had taught her the term. Pointing to the specimens, she noted that one was a fish while the other was a mammal, an ancestor of the land. She described how the land creature had returned to the sea and, over many years, acquired an appearance nearly identical to a large fish. She smiled, noting that although they shared a similar appearance, they were entirely different creatures. Later, the two sat in a space that resembled a bookstore, sipping tea. Solitaire addressed Macht's question about why demons lacked emotions like malice or guilt, calling it a trivial inquiry. She suggested he had known the answer since birth. If demons felt troubled when deceiving others, they would have long ago gone extinct. Macht asked what it meant to feel troubled. Solitaire smiled, stating that it was an emotion they would never understand. She explained that their human-like appearance, their shared language, and their behavior were all merely tools acquired to deceive and prey on mankind, a proof of their evolution. She emphasized that despite their outward appearance, the difference between demons and people was unfathomable. To humans, demons were monstrous cannibals, noting that it was natural to have emotions they couldn't understand. She compared his quest to imagining the emotions of a small flying insect. It was a waste of time to wonder. Macht, however, suggested that if they could understand these emotions, they might be able to coexist. He noted that demons had all the time in the world to waste. Solitaire looked at him, finding his fascination with coexistence to be quite intriguing. The scene shifted once more to another village, where the work of death was already finished. Macht sat alone on a stone staircase amidst the ruins, lost in solemn thought. Suddenly, another demon appeared behind him. Macht called out the man's name, Schlacht. Schlacht addressed him as the Sage of Destruction. He stated that he required Macht's assistance in taking down the hero of the South. Upon hearing the request, Macht remained silent, the weight of the coming conflict hanging between them. Schlacht turned to Macht and stated that he required his assistance in taking down the hero of the South. Macht paused for a long second. He asked Schlacht if he truly looked like someone who would put his life on the line for the Great Demon King, urging him not to drag him into any more pointless war games. Macht made it clear that he couldn't care less about the fate of the Demon King's army. Schlacht observed that Macht had always despised battle, yet he noted that this was an imperial command. He warned that if Macht chose to disobey, the other demons would have no choice but to kill him, explaining that the only way to unite their individualist kind was through fear. As Schlacht walked past him, he stated that he was sure Macht understood the reality of their nature. Macht asked if Schlacht intended to make an example out of him, questioning if the seer truly believed he could. Schlacht turned his gaze back, simply asking Macht if he thought he couldn't. A heavy, weighted tension filled the air, before Schlacht finally broke the silence by admitting he would rather not fight. Macht noted that figures like Schlacht, a seer who went out of his way to find him, only did so because he was crucial to the operation. He realized that, for now, he could not disobey. In that moment, another demon, Grausum, appeared atop a nearby building, silently observing the interaction. Macht recognized him, identifying Grausum of the Seven Sages of Destruction as the worst possible match for him. Schlacht asked if Macht understood the situation, and Macht responded by calling him an undeniably odious fellow who always had him dancing like a puppet on a string. He asked Schlacht how he should dance this time. Schlacht told him there was no need for strategy. Macht simply needed to fight. He explained that Macht's overwhelming presence alone would be enough to limit the moves the hero of the South could take. When Macht asked if that was all, Schlacht revealed that he had already fought the hero of the South across countless future worlds he had envisioned, and this was the conclusion he had reached. He assured Macht that no trouble would befall him. Macht deduced that the conclusion must be a draw, and Schlacht nodded in confirmation. Observing Schlacht's expression, Macht remarked that he had the face of someone heading toward their death. Schlacht walked over and sat beside Macht on the staircase, remarking that his fate was something he wouldn't know for sure until he tried it. Schlacht continued, explaining that Grausum was slated to erase Macht's memories after the operation. When Macht asked why, Schlacht explained that his memories were eventually going to be read. He considered it a necessary precaution to prevent an unbefitting oversight, stating that he would not allow anyone to witness their battle with the hero of the South. He described the coming events as a contingency plan for defeat and a fight for the sake of the demons 1,000 years into the future. Strangely, Schlacht called out to Frieren, which left Macht thoroughly confused, wondering why he was using that name. Schlacht simply called it a story for the future, before walking off with Grausum, leaving Macht to sit in the silence. Macht watched them go, hoping Schlacht would return alive. Before fading away, Schlacht mentioned that he had already heard those concerns countless times in the futures he had envisioned. The scene shifted, and time seemed to flow forward. Macht continued his mundane routine, laying waste to human settlements wherever he went. He eventually arrived in a village and stood before 2 children. He handed them 2 daggers and gave the familiar command. He sat down nearby and watched. In the years that had passed, he had slaughtered many, but it was never for sustenance or instinct. It was simply an indiscriminate culling. Yet he still felt no emotion. He had yet to discover the weight of malice or guilt. The battle between the children ended with the boy standing over the girl's bloodied, lifeless body. Macht glared at the boy and asked why he was crying, pointing out that he had survived and should be glad. The boy managed to mutter that the girl hadn't resisted at all. Macht noted that this was obvious, but again asked why he was crying. The boy explained that she was his childhood friend, and, despite being together forever, he had killed her. His legs gave way, and he fell to the ground beside her, asking the lifeless girl why she had acted like she was going to cut him. He pulled her body onto his lap, weeping that he should have been the one to die. Macht watched this display of raw emotion, and smiled mischievously. He stood up and called the scene spectacular. This guy was genuinely fascinated. He told the boy that he possessed an emotion a demon could not perceive. He asked if it was malice or if it was guilt. The boy looked up, his face etched with rage and confusion. Macht concluded, "It must be guilt." He smiled at the boy almost pitifully, asking him to express the feeling in words and to teach him about the emotion. The boy began to cry even harder, thrusting his dagger toward Macht and calling him a monster. Before the strike could land, Macht's sword. As the boy fell, Macht thanked him, noting that he had finally closed in on an answer, despite not even knowing the child's name. He realized he knew nothing about people at all. He reasoned that it was natural not to feel anything, even if hundreds perished, because he had no connection to them. He deduced that he might only understand such emotions if he were to kill someone close to him. To do that, he realized he would need to make human acquaintances and spend enough time with them to call them friends. Luckily, he had all the time in the world. Macht set his sights on the land that would eventually become the Golden City. This was the beginning of the mayhem that would fall upon that city. The event unfolded on a mere whim. On this particular day, Macht had intercepted the carriage of a noble traveling toward the fortified city of Weise. The noble remained remarkably detached from the looming threat of death. He observed that his guards had been first-class subordinates, expressing a quiet surprise that they would be attacked by a demon in such a place. Macht stepped closer, noting that while the man's subordinates were clearly trained in the art of killing, that was precisely the problem. He explained that such people were ill-suited for battle against demons, because they could not rid themselves of the habits of a human killer. Even when demons take on a form similar to humans, Macht reasoned that their physical strength and reaction speed exist on an entirely different level. Those accustomed to fighting other people would perish before realizing the discrepancy, especially if they operated under the assumption that their opponent followed human limitations. The noble took this in with a thoughtful hum, stating he would keep that in mind. With a calm gaze, he asked Macht what it would take for a demon to die. Macht glared at him, asking if the man truly understood his current position. The noble simply asked if Macht enjoyed talking, then reached into his pocket. The movement was sharp enough that Macht drew his blade, the cold steel hovering inches from the noble's face. Instead of a weapon, the man produced a cigarette. He asked for calm, mentioning that he didn't look like a fighter, and only wished to have one last smoke. Macht lowered his guard slightly, telling the man to suit himself. As the noble sat on the ground and lit the cigarette, Macht observed that he was a strange person. He sensed that while the noble did not reek of blood, he bore the unmistakable eyes of a killer. The man admitted he was a detestable noble. Though he had never dirtied his own hands, he had sent many political rivals to their graves. He categorized them as scoundrels, even more irredeemable than himself, yet he confessed that he had not been free of tormenting guilt for a single day. Macht watched him for a second, before the noble remarked that his torment would finally end today. Macht then posed a question, which the noble agreed to answer as long as it didn't take longer than the duration of his smoke. In the silence that followed, the noble fathomed that Macht was interested in the concepts of malice and guilt. The noble noted that while demons likely couldn't understand the concept of evil, it was perhaps more pleasing that way. he surmised that Macht lacked a sense of justice as well. Identifying himself as the feudal lord of Weise, Gluck, he explained that he was merely a figurehead. He described Weise as a dumping ground for nobles defeated in political conflicts at the imperial capital, a place blanketed with malice and corruption. He explained that the ruling families were driven by self-interest and tyranny, allowing the citizens to starve while the law lost all meaning. Gluck lamented the situation, but admitted that people are mysterious beings who often refuse to act until they are at their wits' end. However, his son had been different. He was a man with a strong sense of justice who had made a direct appeal to the influential and troublesome nobles of the city. One day, his son's body was found lifeless on the ground, with a lie claiming he had jumped from a balcony. Gluck knew it was a fabrication, especially since his son had just prepared a birthday present for his much younger sister. That tragedy was 7 years old. Gluck confessed that he had eventually sought retribution, realizing that in a world of power, all it took was a single word to have a subordinate kill. He found it laughable that even a fool could pull off such a thing. When Macht asked if he was seeking revenge, Gluck said he couldn't say for sure that he wasn't. However, his greater goal was to fulfill his son's will by creating an ideal world for people to live in. As he finished his smoke, Gluck told Macht he was done. When Macht asked why he had shared all of this, Gluck revealed it was a negotiation. He proposed that since he had experienced more malice than any man, he could teach Macht about the emotions that were foreign to him. He wasn't pleading for his life. He stated that if Macht wanted to kill him, he had been prepared for that retribution for years. Macht found the proposition fascinating. He smiled and asked for the conditions of the deal. Gluck told him that Macht would serve him and help him deal with the corrupt families holding power. He warned that these rivals were cunning and protected by elite guards. The scene then shifted to the city of Weise, where Macht began a systematic slaughter, clearing the path for Gluck's vision. Later, in the feudal lord's office, a black-haired man stormed in, demanding to know the meaning of the recent violence. He complained that 5 of his relatives had died in just half a year. Gluck remained seated, calmly suggesting they might have been targeted by insurgents, noting that such incidents were commonplace in Weise. He stood up, suggesting the man must have made enemies, and offered to look into it. When the man accused him of playing innocent, Gluck reminded him of his own words when his son had died, asking if the man was suffering from a persecutory delusion. As Gluck walked past him, he advised the man to go home, rest, and be sure to lock his doors. Sometime later, amidst the bustling markets of a recovering city, Gluck stood on a balcony overlooking the people. He turned to Macht, noting that soon the demon would need to work for him on the front stage as well. Macht acknowledged the order. Gluck reaffirmed his position as the feudal lord, prompting Macht to smile and bow deeply. He told Gluck that he would do as he commanded. The memories continued to unfold, revealing a quiet afternoon within the estate where Gluck sat at ease while Macht stood behind him, carefully pouring tea. Macht inquired about the specific work Gluck required of him on the front stage of society. Gluck noted that the Demon King had been defeated by the hero Himmel and his party, a fact Macht acknowledged with a calm nod. Gluck paused for a moment, asking if the demon had any particular thoughts regarding the defeat of his ruler. Macht admitted he felt none in particular. Gluck stood and then took a stance, gazing out over the city. He observed that Weise had been bustling like a festival every day, the citizens truly elated by the victory. He revealed his plan to officially grant Macht the status of personal mage to the Gluck family, claiming it as a testament to the peace they had attained. Macht placed the tea on the table as Gluck explained that this status would allow them to take action more easily in the public eye. When Macht asked why he was going to such lengths, Gluck sipped the tea and remarked on its nostalgic taste and unique aroma. He asked if demons customarily enjoyed black tea, to which Macht admitted he was merely rehearsing the process from memory. Gluck questioned why he had chosen these specific leaves, and Macht revealed that a servant had informed him that Gluck's late wife often drank this blend. Gluck realized this gesture was done unintentionally, yet he noted that Macht was unusually skilled at interpersonal conduct. He remarked that no servant would speak of such personal circumstances easily unless they had been charmed. He deduced that demons possessed a natural, perhaps even unconscious, ability to deceive humans into trusting them. Macht gathered that Gluck now wanted him to deal with nobles on the front stage as well. Gluck confirmed this, stating it was best to have many allies and that murder should only be a last resort. Sipping his tea slowly, Gluck asked if Macht understood that they were currently holding a sinful conversation. Macht smiled, confessing that he did not understand the concept of sin, though he could see that Gluck seemed to be enjoying himself. Gluck smiled back, calling Macht a monster who understood neither justice nor sin. He vowed to show him the meaning of both, instructing Macht to act, converse, and kill exactly as ordered. Eventually, Gluck believed, the demon would understand. Macht wondered aloud what would happen if he still failed to understand in the end. Gluck stood firmly, stating that since he was the one who chose to use Macht's powers, he would stay with him until he did, even if it meant going to the depths of hell. Macht asked if Gluck had already worked out a plan to eliminate him once Weise was fully subdued. Gluck only smiled and asked what the demon thought, to which Macht admitted he was looking forward to it. Following this, they addressed the subordinates of Weise and began their mundane tasks. Macht spent time training students and conversing with the elderly, attempting to integrate into their culture and understand the nobility better. During a formal meeting years later, Macht stood among a congregation of wise advisors. One of the men in the meeting spoke to Macht, noting that over the past few years, the demon had put great effort into the city and saved many with his advice. He asked why Macht had chosen to live in a fortified city. Macht smiled and spoke of the never-ending cycle of revenge between mankind and demons, stating that living together and understanding each other was the first step toward coexistence. The advisor called this a magnificent view and expressed his favor for the idea. However, another advisor leaned in and whispered into the man's ear. The man's tone shifted, noting it would be wonderful if every demon were so friendly. He asked if Macht would be willing to fight to protect the citizens of Weise. Suddenly, the real Gluck walked into the room and called Macht out. Once they were alone, Gluck explained that they were in a troublesome situation. Macht sensed the change in the air, stating that the enemy was already within the range of his mana detection. Gluck found the term enemy interesting, explaining that surviving forces of the Demon King's army were headed for Weise. When Gluck asked what the nobles had told him, Macht replied that they seemed to be testing his loyalty. Gluck called the notion asinine, knowing Macht possessed no such feeling. He told Macht it would be easy to kill his own race to win the trust of the people, since he bore no loyalty to them. Gluck walked off, commanding Macht to go and defeat the enemies of Weise. The scene shifted to a forest landscape littered with the dismembered bodies of demons. Macht stood over General Shrag, the lightning flash, who lay defeated on the ground. He remarked that he thought Shrag would have been a wiser man, lamenting that this was how leaders empowered by the Demon King ended up when their master no longer existed. Macht returned to the city and found Gluck sipping tea. Gluck noted that Macht had volunteered to be a magic instructor, and observed that, unlike other demons, he was capable of using human magic. Macht explained he had learned from a demon named Zoltraak, who researched human spells. Gluck asked if he could use Zoltraak, the ordinary offense magic that dominated the battlefield. Macht responded with respect, noting that an old friend of his had produced that great demonic spell, and that he was far more skilled at it than any human. Gluck then made a new proposal. They walked to a church where a young boy was praying solemnly. Gluck explained that the boy was a relative who had lost both parents and now prayed every day. The boy had expressed a wish to become a mage, and Gluck commanded Macht to teach him magic to help him cope with his loss. Macht accepted the command. As the boy walked out of the church, he found Macht waiting. The demon introduced himself, but the boy, Denken, stated he did not trust him because demons had killed his parents. Macht noted that made it all the more worthwhile to teach him. Denken asked if Macht was powerful, and Gluck confirmed he was the strongest among the 7 sages of destruction. Denken asked if he could become strong enough to kill the demon. Macht looked at his new pupil and replied that it would depend entirely on Denken's own intentions. In the quiet of the forest, near the edge of a still lake, Denken and Macht practiced the art of magic. After he released a practice attack, Macht observed that his pupil was losing concentration and suggested they take a break. He noted that it was difficult enough for a composed demon to penetrate a rock at such a distance. Denken, however, paid him no mind. He took a deliberate breath, centered his spirit, and unleashed a ray of Zoltraak once more. The beam shot forward with surprising velocity, piercing straight through a massive rock in front of them. Macht smiled, genuinely surprised by the feat. Denken turned back toward his mentor with a grin, asking if they could finally take that break now. Their rest was punctuated by the arrival of a carriage. A young lady stepped down, bringing food to share with Denken. Behind them, Gluck sat comfortably on the grass, watching the peaceful scene. He observed to Macht that every human has something they live for, even if it is a desire for revenge. He noted that Denken was now far healthier than when he had spent his days praying in sorrow. Witnessing the boy's smile again was a victory in itself. Gluck reminded Macht that he was the boy's mentor, but also the enemy to be vanquished, and urged him to keep it that way. Macht acknowledged the command. Looking toward the pair, Macht wondered if the young lady was fond of Denken. Gluck refused, clearly only seeing what he wanted to see. The seasons flowed into one another. Macht guided Denken through his meditation, teaching him from ancient books and practicing spells in the deep woods. As time passed, Denken transitioned into a guard, slaying opponents with an effortless grace that spoke of his mentor's influence. Through all these journeys, the young lady, Lecture, remained by his side. One evening, inside Gluck's office, the feudal lord informed Macht that the marriage between his daughter Lecture and Denken had been finalized. Denken would officially become the son-in-law of the Gluck family. Gluck noted Macht's expression, but the demon simply replied that it was his ordinary smile, adding that his earlier predictions about the pair had been correct. Gluck admitted that if Denken had not achieved so much as an enlisted civilian mage, the marriage would never have materialized. He credited Macht for this growth, though Macht remained humble, bowing and stating that it was entirely due to Denken's own abilities. The atmosphere shifted as Gluck shared troubling news. A remnant of the Demon King's army had attacked the northern end of the plateau, and a single demon had exterminated an entire fortified city. Traces of this demon had yet to be found. Gluck asked if Macht had any knowledge of this, and Macht asked in return if Gluck truly believed he did. Gluck knew he didn't, but he explained that the public thought otherwise. Macht gathered as much, acknowledging that only a great demon, one of the 7 sages of destruction, could pull off such a feat. Gluck explained that public opinion had sided with the suspicious nobles, and he had no choice but to accede to their demands. When Macht asked if he was to be executed, Gluck doubted such a thing was even possible. Instead, he presented a stone bracelet on the table, the Stone Bracelet of Sovereignty, a magical item crafted by Sage Elwig. Gluck looked through the window, noting that the groundwork of the nobles outside the government was a magnificent, if crafty, sight. They had made allies of the masses, and demanded that Macht be placed under their control to serve the citizens of Weise. Gluck asked Macht what he thought of this malice, calling it tremendously laughable that they had no idea what demons were truly like. Gluck warned that once the bracelet was equipped, the instant Macht bore malice toward the citizens of Weise, he would die. Macht smiled back, telling Gluck that he would have to accompany him to the depths of hell. Gluck agreed, and Macht welcomed the coming amusement. They went out before the people, and Macht accepted the bracelet, taking the vow to bear no malice. Life continued in a mundane cycle of light and dark. They spent quiet moments on balconies, visited Lecture in her room when she fell ill, and went fishing at the stream. But time eventually caught up with Gluck's daughter. Inside the church, Lecture's lifeless body lay within a casket. Gluck stood beside Denken, looking at his daughter's corpse. He noted that she had always possessed a frail body, and that they had been mentally prepared for this. He thanked Denken for his hard work, sure that his daughter had lived happily. Denken remained stone cold, silent in his grief. Later, at the tombstone, Gluck knelt in prayer. He mentioned to Macht that Denken had not returned for many years, which seemed natural given his devotion. Macht cautioned Gluck that visiting the grave every day was harmful to his health. He reminded Gluck of his own words, stating he could not imagine it being healthy to keep praying in sorrow. Gluck smiled at the irony, surprised to hear such words from a demon. As Gluck tried to rise, his aged body failed him. Macht reached out and gently grabbed his hand to help him up. Surprised but accepting, Gluck allowed Macht to accompany him. As they walked, Gluck remarked on how frail he had become. Macht offered to call a carriage, but Gluck preferred to walk. As they approached the house, Gluck observed that Macht had not changed at all, while he himself had withered. He realized the vast difference in how time feels to a human versus a demon. He assumed the time they spent together was merely a transient event to Macht. Our boy Macht, however, responded that even if it was transient, their time together was irreplaceable in his mind. Gluck smiled, calling it off-putting, but admitting he felt the same, that they were wonderful partners in crime. In that moment, at Gluck's feet, Macht began to weave his spell. He told Gluck that he had decided to eliminate all of it. He smiled, believing that by destroying the city, he would finally understand the concept of malice and how it felt to have guilt. Gluck grew sad for a second, but then pulled out a cigarette. This guy smiled and asked Macht for a light, noting it would truly be his last smoke. Macht knelt and lit it for him. Gluck confessed he had known this moment would eventually arrive, having watched Macht for 30 years. As the gold began to engulf Gluck's legs and climb his body, he told Macht he had been a dear partner and a hopeless scoundrel. He predicted that Macht would one day be punished, just as he was. Gluck's final words were that it had been fun. Macht concurred. In less than a minute, the entirety of Weise was turned to gold, frozen forever as the Great City of Gold. After the entire city of Weise had been rendered into silent, shimmering gold, Macht sat alone by a fountain. He observed the morning light reflecting off the metallic surfaces, wondering exactly how much time had passed. He touched the stone bracelet of sovereignty on his wrist, realizing with a start that he was still alive. He fathomed that, in the end, despite the destruction he had wrought, he still felt no emotions whatsoever. He realized he could not stay there for eternity, yet he sensed he had managed to grasp a fragment of understanding. This guy was already looking toward his next move, deciding to make use of the next settlement. In that moment, a presence materialized behind him, and a voice informed him that there would be no next one for him. The speaker was Serie, the great mage. Macht had been unable to sense her mana at all until she stood directly behind him. She commanded him to return Weise to normal immediately or face death. Serie stood firm, telling him that a demon should not risk their life for such things, though Macht's silence gave it all away. She smiled, finding it intriguing that Macht was unable to reverse the spell. She explained that magic is the world of visualization. Transmutation into gold and its undoing were entirely different stories. She reasoned that for a monster like him, who could not understand mankind, generating people from gold was an impossible feat. Macht suddenly dashed forward, his hand snapping out to grab Serie by the shoulder while calling her a wretch. Serie's smile remained as the attack backfired. Macht's own hand began to solidify, turning into gold in an instant. This guy realized his mistake and immediately dashed a couple of steps back, away from her. He asked what she had done. Serie explained she had used her curse reversal magic, Mistilsla. She stood there calmly, noting that if he had been a little more serious, she would have been able to transmute his entire body. Macht asked how she could pull off such a feat, claiming the principles of Dialgoza's universal golden transmutation should be impossible to analyze. Serie replied that there was no need to understand the principles. Her magic simply reflected anything it perceived to be a curse. She described it as a manifestation of ancient wisdom that disregarded all logical analysis. She admitted she didn't particularly like the spell, but found it perfect to consign Macht of El Dorado to oblivion. Macht asked again who she was. Serie introduced herself as the Great Mage Serie from the mythical era, a time so long ago that demons had completely forgotten the fear she represented. Macht accepted her words and, with a focus of will, turned his hand back to normal. He sensed she was different from any of the devils he had fought before. In an instant, he grabbed his coat, turning it into a sword, and lunged at her. As the blade tried to pierce her, the sword began to shatter fragment by fragment. She noted that he could freely restore his own body from gold. She then fired a heavy shot of Zoltraak at him. Before the massive explosion, Macht's sword turned back into a coat and encircled him as a shield. Serie observed that despite his primitive technique, he could not construct a visualization of returning people to normal. She called him a monster at the pinnacle of magic, who was still just a monster at the end of the day. Macht, visibly annoyed by her commentary, floated into the air and told her to be silent. He unleashed multiple Zoltraaks. Serie weaved through the air, using her concentrated shields to dodge the attacks individually. She fired a massive laser from her hand upwards at him. Macht used a wide, all-encompassing shield to block the blast. As the dust settled, Serie called his use of defense magic truly fascinating. They glared at each other, Serie asking what magic he would show her next. Suddenly, an interference whooshed into the scene. A man named Luelon used a sealing spell to enclose Macht within a large cube. Macht expressed a calm annoyance at the interruption, and Serie felt the same. She addressed Lernen, who was there with another disciple. The other guy told Lernen the seal wouldn't last long. Siri called them foolish disciples for their unnecessary behavior, having told them to wait. Lernen told Siri that if she killed Macht, they would permanently lose the Dialgoze magic and the chance to return the city of Weise to normal. Siri shouted at Lernen, warning that if they didn't finish Macht now, the destruction would not end with Weise. She knew that if this man felt like it, he had the power to transmute the entire northern plateau into gold. Macht began to crack the cube from the inside, causing Lernen to sweat. Lernen insisted that the first-class mages would seal Macht inside until they found a means to return the city to normal, however many hundreds of years it took. Siri, suddenly bored, walked off, stating she didn't care anymore and they could do as they liked. Lernen expressed gratitude for her blessing. 6 mages stood together and conjured a massive dome that uncovered the city and sealed Macht inside. Macht slowly descended as the cube broke, looking up at the perfect dome that now served as his prison. The memory ended, and light particles burst as Frieren and Denken stood face to face. Denken was elation personified, calling Frieren a godsend for deciphering the memory. Suddenly, Frieren fell backward, and Fern was able to catch her before she hit the ground. Stark noticed she was dozing off. Frieren explained that she was deciphering the memories in further detail, which was using up an extraordinary amount of mana and weakening her ability to process anything else. She stated she couldn't move normally in this state, and would need Fern to feed her. Looking slightly confused but smiling like a cat, she added that later Fern would have to help her change, bathe, and tie her hair. Fern wondered how that was any different from their usual routine. Suddenly, Fern turned her gaze, sensing something. Stark asked what was wrong. She mentioned that for a split second, an extraordinary amount of mana had been detected. The scene cut to a different space where Solitaire stood looking out at the vast forest. She smiled with anticipation, noting that it was finally time to begin deciphering the Great Barrier of El Dorado. The day moved forward with a deliberate, steady tempo. Denken, Freeren, and the rest of the group had gathered. Denken was busy preparing a pot of soup. He turned his attention to Fern, mentioning her recent discovery. He noted that she had sensed someone bearing immense mana in the outskirts around the City of Gold. Fern concurred, though she cautioned that the response had lasted only an instant. She fathomed that it might have been a misleading thought or a miscalculation during mana detection. Denken brought a bowl of soup over to Fern, explaining that the proximity to the city often caused such errors due to the imperceivable magical curses lingering in the air. He noted that his own detection had given off no response. However, he admitted he was not senile enough to overestimate his power, and insisted they remain vigilant. He reasoned that if someone truly was out there, they might have waited for the moment Frieren's detection became weak enough to allow an approach, and they could be hiding nearby. Frieren, who was being fed by Fern due to her weakened state, noted that if someone was hiding near the city, even she might not be able to detect them. Fern told Frieren to chew her food well as she fed her, while Denken suggested they survey the area afterward. Stark, observing the scene, noted that Frieren seemed to be a rather good-for-nothing elf when she behaved like this. He asked Fern if she wasn't spoiling her a little too much. Frieren calmly asked Stark if he was jealous, which he quickly denied. Fern then suggested they take turns, which confused Stark. Denken stepped in, suggesting they feed Frieren some vegetables as well. As he handed them over, Stark continued to be annoyed by Frieren's laziness. Frieren explained that she couldn't help it. She was analyzing the colossal amount of Macht's memories, and she felt she deserved to be rewarded. Fern continued to feed her, urging her to eat. Frieren opened her mouth wide but quickly noted how much she hated onions. Stark leaned in, jokingly suggesting they feed her even more vegetables. When Stark asked how long the analysis would take, Frieren guessed it would be around 2 months. Stark was shocked, but Fern noted that Frieren always took her precious time. Denken, however, was satisfied. He had expected a detailed analysis to take 3 years, so 2 months felt like a blessing. He apologized for stalling their journey, but Stark and Fern assured him that stopping like this was an everyday occurrence when traveling with Frieren. However, there was a small problem. Recognizing that the small hut lacked even a bed, Denken decided they should lodge in a nearby settlement. They went back outside, to where Fern was finishing with Frieren. Stark announced the move, but he noticed Frieren's body beginning to shake. Fern was no longer feeding her, she was braiding her hair. Stark recognized the specific braid. It was the one Fern did when she was angry. Fern was braiding it quite roughly, because Frieren hadn't eaten all her food. Meanwhile, in the forest, Zoltraak sat on a log, and, at the edge of the barrier that separated Weise from the world, Macht appeared and sat on a rock. Zoltraak noted that he probably couldn't hear her voice through the barrier, but she spoke anyway. She informed him that Frieren the Slayer had begun analyzing his memories. She knew Macht likely didn't care, but she warned him that Frieren was an extremely brilliant mage, one of the few who could actually kill him. Zoltraak expressed a desire to witness the conclusion of the story regarding coexistence with mankind, a tragic conclusion she was sure would eventually arrive. She stood up and approached the barrier, tapping it gently. She admitted she was incredibly cowardly and fearful, and far from wise enough to make light of mankind. Upon analyzing the barrier, she understood why a prominent mage like Macht hadn't been able to dispel it. She reasoned that it was a sophisticated coalescence of magical theories from many different countries and races, the combined wisdom of mankind's greatest mages. She knew that such a barrier could not be destroyed by demons who weren't eccentric enough to research human magic. Stretching out her hand, a massive magic circle appeared. She told Macht it would take her about 2 months to analyze the dome. Macht simply sat there, watching her in silence. The 2 months passed slowly. In the day, Frieren stayed in bed, deep in the memories, or relaxed while Fern tended to her. Sometimes they dressed up or visited a nearby inn. Stark spent his time working out or scouting the forest to ensure their safety. Eventually, as Frieren lay on her bed, she sensed the end was near. She knew that Macht's memories and his Dialgoze magic were almost fully analyzed. At the same time, Zoltraak reached the end of her own work. She recognized the various human theories woven into the barrier and the masterpieces of imperial magic. She had finally analyzed it all. A wide crack suddenly unfolded across the shimmering dome. She called it a work of art that was almost a shame to destroy. Back in the town, Stark found Fern and asked about Freeren. Fern mentioned that the analysis would be finished in 2 days, but suddenly, both Fern and Denken felt a massive wave of mana. Freeren recognized the sensation immediately. It was the same mana from before. In an instant, the entire dome enclosing the city of Weise shattered. Inside the space, Macht sat by the fountain, unbothered by the sudden change. Zoltraak stood outside the ruins of the barrier, smiling to herself. And Zoltraak was ready to begin the battle for coexistence. It was a situation that Frieren's group might not be prepared to contain. From a distance, Fern, Stark, and Denken watched as the seal shattered and the Golden Land revealed itself. The Great Barrier of El Dorado was destroyed. Denken watched in silence before noting that there was no longer any need to hide. He fathomed that Fern had not been deceived by her mana detection after all. He now sensed a powerful presence, a demon whose mana rivaled that of Macht himself. He reasoned that this newcomer had either come to rescue Macht or harbored a different motive entirely, but the result remained the same. Macht, a dire threat to mankind, was now released back into the wild. The atmosphere grew heavy, as Stark noticed a subtle, terrifying change in the landscape. He pointed out that the range of the gold was beginning to widen, the metallic curse creeping outward and devouring the surrounding greenery, prompting Fern to suggest they take Frieren and retreat immediately. Denken agreed that evacuation was inevitable, and decided to head toward the settlement to warn the people. Deep within the silent golden city, Macht remained by the waterfall. Zoltraak walked into the scene. Macht asked what she intended by this, but Zoltraak simply inquired if he had finally discovered the emotions he had been seeking. Zoltraak gathered that he had failed. She noted that their ideologies were polar opposites, yet she respected his inquisitive mind. She sat beside him and explained that to experiment is to fail, and through failing many times, one eventually derives an answer. She encouraged him to move on, admitting she wanted to be proven right in her belief that coexistence was merely a whimsical dream. She offered her assistance for whatever he planned next. Macht looked at her and told her to do as she liked. The scene shifted to the evacuation. Stark carefully lifted Frieren onto the wagon, noting with concern that for some reason she refused to wake up. Denken recognized that she was likely dedicating the full extent of her resources to the task at hand, trying to finish the analysis of Macht's memories as quickly as possible. As the carriage began to move, Fern sensed the approach of the demon who had destroyed the barrier. Stark realized they wouldn't be able to escape while burdened by such a large gathering. He decided to stay behind to hold the enemy back. Fern immediately offered to stay as well, but Denken stepped in, intending to face the threat himself. The three of them paused, glaring at one another in a moment of tense disagreement. Finally, Frieren insisted that Denken take care of Freeren and the settlers. She was sure that once Freeren finished the analysis, she would resolve the situation. Stark added that despite their appearance, they were quite powerful. Frieren noticed his hand was shaking, but Denken simply apologized and allowed them to take their stand. Soon after, Solitär walked into a clearing, the trees spreading out around her. Frieren and Stark stood their ground as she approached. She smiled warmly, telling them there was no need to be at the ready, because she had no intention to fight. She claimed she simply wished to learn about them and invited them to join her for a short conversation. Stark, his axe already gripped tightly, sensed a power far greater than expected. When he mentioned this to Frieren, she looked at the mana encircling Solitär and realized she couldn't see its true depth. The demon seemed almost weak, which was a terrifying deception in itself. Solitär introduced herself as the Great Demon Solitär, expressing hope that they could get along. Frieren felt a deep, cold discomfort. Stark asked if she knew the name, but Frieren shook her head. She remembered how Freeren had drilled the names of every great demon into her mind, yet she had never heard of Solitär. In Frieren's memory, Frieren had explained the various sages and gods of war, warning her that she was still half a century too young to take them on. She had given Frieren one specific instruction. If she ever encountered a great demon who wasn't among the ones she had been taught, then she must run without hesitation. Frieren asked why, to which Frieren explained that every single great demon with vast mana has lived for eons. If there is no record of them among mankind, there is a strong possibility that everyone who encountered them was massacred. Back in the present, Stark realized that they were facing someone who left no survivors. He asked Frieren if they could escape, but when she didn't give a straight answer, he understood they had to stay to buy time for the others. Solitär tried to maintain her friendly facade, claiming she had merely lived in secret and never killed a person. She invited them to talk to her like a big sister. Frieren saw through the lie immediately. Frieren fired a shot of Zoltraak without warning. As the dust settled, Solitär stood behind a shield, smiling. She complimented Frieren's lack of hesitation and her training. Frieren was surprised to see a demon using defense magic so effectively. Solitär's interest grew, and she began peppering Frieren with random questions about her name, her master, and even her hair ornament. Solitär was talking as if they were old friends, but the warmth was hollow. As Frieren prepared another attack, a massive sword suddenly materialized and pierced through her shoulder. The force of the blow caused her to drop her staff. The sword shattered into particles inside the wound. Stark screamed her name as Solitär walked closer, dozens of massive swords now levitating around her. Stark dropped his axe and caught Frieren, lowering her to the ground. Solitär warned them that if they attacked again, she would sever their arms to prevent further fighting. She noted that they could still talk even without limbs, and so in a bid to remove the inconvenience, she swung a sword at them, but Stark lunged forward, using his axe to strike the blade before it could move. Solitär dashed through the space with blinding speed. She noted the extraordinary fear Stark was harboring, yet she admired his bravery for facing her. She dropped a sword from the sky, striking Stark in the back and driving him to the ground. Almost instantly, a blast of Zoltraak streaked toward her. Solitär deflected it with her shield, surprised to see Frieren standing once more with her staff in hand. Stark, too, gripped his axe and rose as if the blow had meant nothing. Solitär smiled, finding mankind truly magnificent. She declared that they would teach her everything as the battle truly began. The carriage rattled along the path, transporting the refugees away from the encroaching metallic curse. Within one of the wagons, Frieren lay still, seemingly defenseless to the world around her. Denken watched her for a moment, before he turned to the men accompanying them. He informed them that they should go on ahead without him. One of the elderly settlers called out to him in concern, but Denken reassured the man that once they crossed the bridge, they would be within the safety of the Empire's territory. He reasoned that even a demon as powerful as Macht would find it difficult to make a move there. With a steady gaze, he told them to take care of Frieren. The man wished that the fortunes of war be with him. Deep within the forest, the air grew heavy as Macht descended to the forest floor. He found Denken waiting for him, and the two stood in a silent glare that spoke of decades of history. Macht broke the silence, stating that he had chosen to leave this land. Denken paused, absorbing the words, as Macht questioned if Frieren was still with the settlers. When Denken asked what he would do with that information, Macht explained his intention to eradicate anyone on this land who knew of him. He planned to start over somewhere far away, and understood that it was best to eliminate any pursuers who might derail his plans. Denken spoke then. He told Macht that he already knew the city of Weise could not be restored to normal, yet he had clung to a sliver of hope. He recognized that he had been unable to rid himself of the memory of his dear master, a man who had once devoted himself to the city's well-being. However, Denken's tone shifted to a grounded resolve. If Macht intended to leave and continue being a threat to mankind, there was no longer a reason to allow him to live. Macht smiled at the declaration, asking if Denken was of sound mind. Our boy Denken responded calmly, explaining that the reason he had not fought before was not out of fear or a lack of confidence. He had simply thought there might be a better way to end things, even though it was now obvious that such a path never existed. Macht remarked that Denken spoke as though he stood a chance against him. "I wouldn't know until I've tried," Denken replied. He struck his staff against the ground, his posture firm. As Macht's oppressive aura began to flood the space, Denken sensed the familiar omen of death. He understood the vast difference in their power now, but even so, he fathomed a glimpse of a future where victory was possible. Macht smiled, acknowledging that Denken had always been someone who refused to give up, and the battle commenced instantly. Denken unleashed a barrage of Zoltraak. Before the first exchange could settle, Macht vanished and reappeared high in the air behind Denken. He swung his sword with a heavy, deliberate movement, sending Denken hurtling through the space. Macht touched down and remarked that the exchange reminded him of their old coaching matches. As the dust cleared, it was revealed that Denken had used a shield to deflect the brunt of the blow. He agreed, noting that he had seen those movements countless times. Denken immediately went back on the offensive. Macht recognized with surprise that Denken was reacting to his slashes and accurately targeting his openings, a feat he had never been able to achieve before. As Macht maneuvered through the air to evade, a massive magical attack from Denken suddenly enveloped the space. Macht was forced to manifest an orb shield to protect himself, realizing that Denken's technique and control had improved vastly. In the middle of the chaos, Denken appeared directly behind Macht, his staff leveled. Before Macht could even turn to face the threat, Denken fired a colossal Zoltraak. The force of the blast sent Macht flying toward the ground, though he managed to use his cloak as a shield to dampen the impact. Macht smiled as he rose, admitting he had underestimated his former student and found the combat surprisingly enjoyable. He converted his cloak back into a sword, but his expression grew serious. He reasoned that he could not allow Freeren to reach the Empire. Even with Solitar's help, dispelling the Empire's national defense barrier would be too immense an effort. He decided he had to end the fight now. Macht raised his hand, preparing to cast his golden curse upon Denken. But our boy was one step ahead. Before the invisible magic could take hold, Denken activated the reversal spell. In an instant, Macht's body began to stiffen and shimmer, turning into solid gold. Macht smiled as the transformation took him, finding the turn of events fascinating. Denken had successfully cast the curse reversal magic, Mistilzla. The moment echoed back to a memory from after the first-class mage exam. Denken had stood in Ciri's room, where the great mage questioned his choice. She noted that while Mistilzla was specialized for battle, it was an insipid, difficult magic. She reminded him that mastering it usually required 100 years of practice, an impossible task for a human. However, she used her privilege to transfer the fruits of her own century of practice into a book. Transferring magic was essentially giving away a portion of a mage's life. When her apprentice, Sense, worried that Ciri would no longer be able to resist curses herself, the great mage dismissed the concern, stating she had plenty of other countermeasures and could simply relearn it in a blink of an eye. She warned Denken that the spell consumed a colossal amount of mana and required perfect timing to pinpoint exactly when an invisible curse was being cast. Back in the present, Denken hovered before the golden statue of his master. He knew exactly when the magic was cast. Even without sensing mana or seeing the spell, he had observed Macht for far too long to be deceived. He called out to Macht, stating he was well aware that the demon could restore his body even from gold. "So let the next round begin," Denken declared. Cracks began to spiderweb across the golden surface of Macht's face. The battle was far from over. The scene shifted back to the clearing, where Fern and Stark remained locked in a desperate struggle against Zoltraak. The demon moved with a fluid, haunting grace, noting that she had always loved conversing with people and had gathered many stories from all kinds of people throughout her long life. As she spoke, Fern maintained a relentless assault, firing Zoltraak beams that Zoltraak dodged with effortless ease. The demon continued her casual chatter, inquiring about what people enjoyed eating, the environments that shaped them, or the nature of their occupations. Stark lunged forward to strike her down, but Zoltraak shifted her weight just enough to avoid the blade. The effort seemed almost futile. She stood there, still speaking as if they were merely sharing tea. She realized she would have to torment him until he was no longer able to move. Instantly, she propelled a flurry of swords toward Stark, the blades striking him with heavy impact. From behind, Fern had used the opening to prepare another massive Zoltraak. When she unleashed the spell, Zoltraak managed to dodge. She was sure her defense should have been perfect, yet she had only barely avoided the strike. Suddenly, multiple attacks rained down from above. Fern was floating high in the air, looking gracious and determined as she rained down rapid-fire Zoltraak. Zoltraak laughed, finally recognizing the trick. She deduced it was pure speed and realized this was no ordinary Zoltraak. She asked what the magic was called, but Fern offered no response, answering only with more explosions. When the dust finally settled, Zoltraak remained standing, appearing practically unharmed. Her persistent smile was deeply irritating. Fern, hovering above, recognized that Zoltraak had been obstructed only by her own immense mana. The sheer density of the demon's power was enough to block everything. Fern felt her own techniques and years of training being irrationally pressured by that overwhelming presence. She gathered that the vast difference in the lifespans of humans and demons created a biological gap that felt impossible to overcome. Zoltraak identified the magic as an improved variant of Zoltraak specializing in rapid fire. She admitted it was the first time she had witnessed magic at such a speed, and thanked Fern for the demonstration. As a token of gratitude, she decided to demonstrate her own special magic, and before Fern or Stark could even register the movement, a mana strike hit them. Their bodies fell limp to the ground as Zoltraak stood over them, promising not to kill them yet so they could continue their talk. Suddenly, an unexpected attack streaked through the air and struck Zoltraak in the shoulder. The demon placed her hand over the wound. She was genuinely surprised, but maintained her strange smile. Fern noted that increasing the density of her magic power allowed her attacks to finally get through. Zoltraak reasoned that raising density without sacrificing speed was no simple feat. She was impressed that Fern had managed to observe her so carefully and strike an opening even in such a critical condition. She calculated that if the attack had been slightly more centered toward her heart, it would have been the end for her. The realization filled her with a dark excitement. Fern declared that the next strike would find her heart. Zoltraak licked her lips, finding them truly fascinating. But the warmth of the battle was cut short. A sudden, massive wave of gold rushed through the forest, a silent whoosh that enveloped the space. In an instant, their bodies were turned into unmoving gold. Zoltraak looked at the statues, disappointed that the interruption had come just when things were getting good. The battle in the sky continued as Denken floated before the Sage of Destruction. Macht noted that Denken's ability to predict his spellcasting would only hold until he decided to cast repeatedly from every angle. Our boy Denken didn't wait for the onslaught. He immediately fired a barrage of Zoltraak. Macht dodged the beams with fluid grace, observing that they were entering a war of attrition. He questioned how many more seconds Denken believed he could fight. Denken recognized the dire situation. It was bad. He suddenly vanished from his position, turning and flying away at high speed, as if retreating. Macht watched him flee, remarking that attempting to escape his reach was a futile effort. He noted that the speed at which his gold spread would easily surpass the pace of Denken's flight, but Denken paid the demon no mind. He understood that Macht was mistaken. He wasn't merely running for his own sake. He knew he had to reach Frieren. If she were to turn to gold, it would be the end for everyone. He calculated that if he rushed at maximum speed, he could make it in just 12 more seconds. Most importantly, he felt the heavy weight of responsibility. Before he could reach her, Zoltraak intercepted him. She arrived with her levitating swords, smiling as she suggested that if he was going to run, he should at least share some final words on his deathbed. She unleashed her attack, and Denken's body fell limp, crashing to the ground. She stood over him, Watching as his form began to solidify into gold, she realized that he had deliberately dispelled his Mistilzla, allowing himself to be transmuted to gold, specifically to block her blades. She acknowledged that he was a superior mage after all. In those final moments of consciousness, Denken felt a profound sense of guilt. He was deeply sorry to Frieren, Stark, and Fern. He hoped that perhaps in the future, his life could be saved, and things would be different. The entire landscape had become a frozen, metallic wasteland. Even the camp of settlers, despite their desperate attempt to flee, had been overtaken and turned to gold. It appeared that Frieren, too, had succumbed to the curse. The scene cut to the vast, solidified landscape. Macht looked toward Zoltraak and suggested they move on, noting that the conclusion was over. Zoltraak remarked that it had been rather boring. Macht turned to walk away, observing that boredom was simply an everyday occurrence for their kind. Suddenly, Zoltraak turned, sensing something unusual. When Macht asked what was wrong, she invited him to speak about something fascinating. She mentioned that Aura the Guillotine, one of the 7 sages, had recently been defeated by Freeren. Zoltraak had investigated the residual mana at the site and found something that deeply intrigued her. Surprisingly, Freeren had successfully dispelled the Aureole's submission magic cast on Aura's immortal army. She reasoned that because Aura had fought the hero party for over 80 years, Freeren had been observing and analyzing her magic that entire time. Macht found the story hard to believe, noting they were discussing the magic of a sage of destruction. He asked if Zoltraak was suggesting that Freeren had deciphered the very principles of Aureole's. Zoltraak clarified that it was likely not the case. She explained that the magic of the 7 sages transcends human intellect and reason due to biological differences in their bodies and brain construction. However, she noted that while humans might not understand the principles, it does not mean the magic cannot be dispelled. Zoltraak began to walk, explaining that one can deal with a phenomenon without knowing the process or principles behind it. This guy was making a point. Humans crafted boats before they understood buoyancy. They used sails without knowing the physics of wind and built embankments without understanding waves. She smiled, noting that since ancient times, humans possessed the ability to tackle the unknown simply through observation. This realization caused Macht to pause. He knew Freeren had analyzed his memories. He wondered how many times he had used Dialgoze throughout the century. Zoltraak noted the fascination of the situation. Certain that the war was not yet over. Their enemy, after all, was Freeren the Slayer. The scene shifted to the carriage, where Freeren's gold-encased body lay. Deep within her mind, a memory of her old comrades surfaced. She saw Himmel, Eisen, and Heiter. In the memory, she had told them that their adventure ended there, as the barrier magic of the immortal bows could never be broken by people. Himmel had challenged her, reminding her that magic cannot be realized if one cannot visualize it. He asked what she intended to do if she gave up. Freeren had explained that giving up and being unable to visualize were different. She asked Himmel if he could crush a walnut with his hand. He believed he could, but when she asked if he could crush a diamond, he had hesitated. She pointed out that he couldn't visualize it, because it was too unrealistic for a human. Suddenly, Eisen had intervened, stating plainly that he could do it. He was sure he could crush a diamond. Freeren had smiled, recognizing that knowing Eisen, he probably could. But she was not a monster like him, and she felt she lacked what was needed to break the barrier. Himmel had then gripped his sword, declaring he would make her visualize it by proving nothing is impossible. He swung his blade at the barrier and managed to chip it slightly. "See, Freeren," he had shouted, "it is not indestructible." Eisen agreed to give it a shot as well, believing he could at least crack it. "Fine, you truly are monsters," Freeren had replied, beginning to chant. She didn't know how long it would take, but she moved forward. Heiter then reassured her, mentioning he had cast a spell allowing them to subsist without food or oxygen for 2 months. Eisen had glared at him, wondering if the man was only spectacular when sober. The memory faded. Back in the present, inside the carriage, a barrier suddenly enveloped Freeren. Her eyes snapped open. The long process was complete. She had finally analyzed his memories. She was ready to face Dialgoze. The scene shifted back to the golden territory of the past. Lecter called out to Denken, who had fallen fast asleep at the table. He stirred, rubbing his eyes and apologizing for drifting off. Lecter looked at him warmly, noting the medal pinned to his chest. She congratulated him, remarking that he had made his mark once again. Denken placed a hand on the medal, explaining with a touch of pride that he would now be rewarded with an enormous sum, more than distant nobles like her could ever hope to spend. He told her that with this wealth, she wouldn't have to die. But as he gazed at her, a realization dawned on him. He understood then that this was nothing more than a dream. He remembered receiving that medal decades ago, as if it were yesterday. It had felt like all his efforts had finally paid off. He had planned to return to Weise early the next morning by coach, but on the night he was decorated, a messenger had informed him of her death. He spoke to the memory of Lecter, his voice heavy with regret. He told her that he had not been there to witness her passing, and that he hadn't put in his utmost effort for the sake of medals or money. They paused in the quiet of the dream before Lecter spoke, saying that even if this was only a dream, he was delighted to see her in her last moments, though these words puzzled her. He admitted that he had lost his battle with Macht, who had shown him the true difference in their strengths. He felt that despite 50 years of intensive study, it had still not been enough. Lecter simply asked, "And so what?" She reminded him that he had been bested countless times before, yet he had always persevered. Denken countered that those previous failures were only coaching matches, but she smiled, noting that the Denken she knew would struggle relentlessly to the bitter end. As Denken's mind drifted toward a flashback of his training under Macht, the dream began to dissolve. Reality rushed back as Freeren successfully dispelled the gold solidification magic. Denken opened his eyes where he lay on the ground and asked how many years had passed. Freeren remarked that it had been closer to an hour. Denken began to speak. He mentioned to Freeren as they began to walk that he felt like a fool for having spent so long addressing himself pompously to maintain a false dignity. He noticed a shimmering light around them and asked what it was. Freeren explained it was protective magic. With this, Dialgoze would no longer work on either of them. Denken was genuinely surprised that she had discovered a method to counter the curse. However, Frieren noted that the situation remained dire. Restoring Denken, who happened to be nearby, had kept her completely occupied. Denken gathered that their location had already been seized. Frieren agreed, noting it had been a long time since she encountered enemies so skilled that hiding was impossible. Macht and Solitaire suddenly arrived, their presence weighing heavily on the clearing. Macht spoke to Frieren, stating that while he found it hard to believe she had dispelled his magic, he could no longer permit her to leave. Frieren countered that he never had that intention to begin with. Solitaire introduced herself with a smile, identifying herself as the Great Demon Solitär. Frieren thought to herself that the name didn't ring a bell, but she recognized the demon from Macht's memories. She sensed that this guy Solitaire was powerful, on the same level as Macht himself. Solitaire asked for a little chat, but Frieren stated she had nothing to talk about. The demon suggested that a conversation might allow her to live longer, noting that Frieren surely realized she was at a disadvantage. Solitaire expressed her surprise that Frieren had perfected a countermeasure for Dialgoze, doubting it could be done in merely 2 months. Frieren revealed that she hadn't just used those 2 months. She had experienced the curse firsthand when she fought Macht 6 centuries ago. Macht claimed he did not recall her, but Frieren explained that she was just a random mage who had managed to escape. She wouldn't expect him to remember a mere mage from back then. She recalled how it had taken her a full century just to return her right arm to normal, after it was turned to gold. Since she had actual results from that time, she was confident she could eventually restore her entire body, though she knew it would take time. She reminded Macht of their earlier discussion in Weise, and he realized then that she had been provoking him on purpose. Frieren confirmed this, explaining that she wanted to witness the exact moment he cast the curse to improve her dispelling accuracy. Macht was shocked by the insanity of her gamble. She had no guarantee of restoration if her entire body turned to gold. Frieren admitted it was a gamble, but noted that Macht hadn't bitten. His vigilance had proven to her that he didn't believe Dialgoze was flawless. She realized that if she factored in his memories, there was a theory she could construct to perfect the magic. "I can even return El Dorado back to normal now," Frieren declared. This guy Macht grew visibly annoyed as Denken glared at him. Frieren readied her staff, though she admitted she would need to analyze the city itself before she could restore it. She took a battle stance, telling them that since they had heard what they wanted, the battle should begin. Frieren unleashed a massive magical attack, forcing Macht to fly back. Solitaire blocked the strike with her defense magic, asking if Frieren was serious. She suggested that even with a counter for the curse, contending against 2 great demons was unwise, and that retreating was the best option. However, the lines were drawn. Frieren fired Zoltraak at Macht as she moved, stating that while she wished to retreat, the risk of letting the enemy of mankind remain was too great. Solitär smiled at the enemy of mankind label, calling it brazen. As Denken attacked Solitär, she reminded him that he had seen Macht's memories and knew that Macht truly desired coexistence from the bottom of his heart, unlike other demons. As she spoke, one of her blades sliced through Denken's magic and cut him. Frieren noticed him falling back, but the distraction gave Macht an opening to strike her down as well. Denken managed to pick himself up, earning a compliment from Solitär on his reaction speed. Frieren likewise used her staff to dodge Macht's lethal blow. She admitted to Macht that during the time he desired coexistence, he did act differently from other monstrous demons. She told him that she respected that he was only the 2nd demon she had ever known to go so far to compromise. "This is precisely why I cannot reach an understanding," Frieren said. She pointed out that the more he desired coexistence, the more people died. Macht asked if there was an issue with that, believing that if he could comprehend mankind, the path to coexistence would arrive. Frieren cut him short, asking how many more must die first. She reminded him that the Demon King had wished for coexistence too, and in that pursuit he had laid waste to so many nations that mankind's influence was now only 1/3 of what it once was. "Your wish will lead to our extinction," she said angrily. "We people are not affectionate enough to wait until then," she declared, pointing her staff at him. She told him the time for retribution had come. Macht smiled at the word retribution, remembering how Gluck had once told him he would one day be punished. He told Frieren that if he was being judged as evil, it was a great honor, and urged her to show him what she could do. Denken called out to Frieren, asking to handle the fight against Macht himself. Frieren asked if he thought he could do it. When Denken turned his gaze away in silence, Frieren understood. "I see," she said. "Well then, I suppose I shall slay Solitär instead." She turned her full attention toward the smiling demon. The battle between the great mage and the mysterious demon was about to begin. Frieren focused her gaze on Solitär. The demon wasted no time, manifesting a flurry of swords that hissed through the air toward the mage. Frieren raised a steady defense, but as the dust from the initial clash settled, the weight of the atmosphere told her they had drifted further from the city of Weise than she had intended. She realized she had been separated from Denken. Seeking to regain the initiative, Frieren unleashed Hell Inferno, a specialized fire magic, intended to consume the space around her opponent. Solitär, however, moved with a fluid, unsettling grace, deploying her own defense magic to dodge the searing heat. Frieren recognized the formidable nature of her foe. As the blades continued to rain down in a relentless barrage, Frieren dodged them with calculated rhythmic movements. She mentioned that, even if they had stayed together, she had no intention of helping Denken. Solitär, smiling through the chaos, admitted she was a bit of a worrier, and had chosen the path with the highest chance of victory. She reasoned that humans were far more skilled at coordination than demons, making the separation a tactical necessity. One of Solitär's swords moved with a sudden, deceptive velocity, catching Frieren and grazing her cheek. Solitär remarked that Frieren was remarkably cold-hearted, suggesting that at this rate, Denken would surely be killed by Macht. She followed this with a massive barrage that struck the earth, the resulting explosion carving a crater into the forest floor. As the dust cleared, Frieren stood firm. She wiped the thin trail of blood from her face and told Solitär that demons were failures of logic. She stated that she wasn't worried about Denken at all. Recalling the fierce, winning glare Denken had given her earlier, she recognized his intent. She had chosen to rely on him to cover her back, and she would not let that trust falter. Frieren shifted her stance and invoked destructive lightning. The sparks crackled with a deafening roar, lashing out at the demon, but Solitär again slipped through the gaps of the attack. Frieren stood her ground, declaring that her duty now was to definitively consign the great demon Solitär to oblivion. Solitär smiled, finding it hard to believe Frieren expected a human to survive against Macht of El Dorado. She asserted that a Sage of Destruction would not lose to a human simply because he lacked certain magics. Then, Solitär paused, her expression shifting as she realized that oversight and arrogance were the fatal flaws of a predator. She admitted that many demons had lost their lives for that very reason. Yet they had still not learned what it meant to be the ones being hunted. The swords surrounding Zoltraak dispersed into mana particles as she descended slowly to the forest floor. Zoltraak mentioned that she would have liked to speak at more leisure, but she fathomed that the ideal approach was to eliminate Frieren with all her might before heading over to assist Macht. Suddenly, the flow of mana in the clearing distorted. Before Frieren could reinforce her position, a massive, straight-lined attack struck her, bypassing her shield entirely. A thick fog of cognitive dissonance began to cloud Frieren's mind. Zoltraak stood with her hands extended, smiling. She explained that this was her most powerful spell, a simple, researched blast that did nothing but obliterate mana. She called it the easiest way to kill a person. However, Frieren's resilience proved robust. She appeared to Zoltraak's left, floating in the air despite the blood spilling from her new wounds. Zoltraak turned her gaze, noting that enemies with great mana were truly sturdy. She unleashed another blast, striking Frieren again and causing more blood to spray against the trees. Frieren reasoned that while their mana levels were similar, Zoltraak's control was from another dimension. The attacks were monotonous but executed with such unfathomable density that they pierced her defense magic as if it were made of scrap paper. She recognized that she could not withstand such hits indefinitely. A direct hit to a vital spot would mean instant death. She fired another bolt of lightning, but it was negated by an impenetrable wall of similar density protecting the demon. Every offensive spell Frieren tried, even her fire magic, was neutralized. The stability and accuracy of Zoltraak's mana manipulation without any incantation defied all logic. In a blur of motion, Zoltraak bypassed Frieren's flames and appeared directly in front of her. She unleashed her strongest skill at point-blank range. The resulting explosion sent Frieren's disheveled body crashing against a massive tree. As Frieren sat there, looking pitiful amongst the wreckage, she admitted to herself that she despised nameless great demons. Zoltraak called out to her, suggesting it was time for Frieren to exhibit her full power. The demon revealed she had investigated the manner from the battle with Aureole and knew Frieren was suppressing her mana. She expressed astonishment at seeing it firsthand, noting that there wasn't even a slight fluctuation in Frieren's restriction. Zoltraak remarked that such a feat could not be acquired through a few centuries of training. It represented a terrifying pool of blood and tears. Freeren simply responded that Zoltraak was a bit of a blabbermouth. Zoltraak laughed, saying she hadn't told anyone else because no one would believe how flawless the restriction was. Freeren stood up, her gaze turning cold. She was sure she had to slay this girl here and now. She unleashed her fire magic again, and as Zoltraak moved back to dodge, the demon mentioned that Fern's apprentice-level mana restriction was also impressive but far from perfect. Frieren's focus sharpened. She asked if Zoltraak had fought Fern and the others. Zoltraak confirmed it, pointing to the wound on her shoulder and praising the coordination of Frieren's comrades. When Frieren remarked that Fern seemed to be capable now, Zoltraak's smile turned cruel. She stated that she had killed them both. Frieren's eyes widened. A heavy silence fell as she tried to process the claim. Her hand dropped, her mind momentarily failing to remedy the cruelty of the statement. But then, as Zoltraak appeared beside her to deliver a finishing blow, Frieren's emotions seemed to vanish. She stretched out her hand and fired an attack so dense it gouged blood from Zoltraak's form, propelling the demon across the forest in a massive explosion. Frieren then exuded a staggering amount of mana, her aura saturating the air. She looked toward Zoltraak's crumpled body and noted that the spell was one she could mirror. Frieren began to gather mana into the same concentrated blast Zoltraak had used. Zoltraak was about to take back every bit of the destruction she had dished out. The real fight was just beginning. Across the clearing, Zoltraak began to laugh, a heavy, jarring sound that caused Frieren to glare at her as if the demon had finally lost her mind. Zoltraak screamed that it was magnificent. She pressed her hand to the earth, admitting that despite her innumerable conversations and experiences, this was perhaps her very first time enduring a battle to the death. Suddenly, Zoltraak dashed from her position. She appeared directly in front of Frieren, her palm brimming with a lethal mana blast. Frieren moved with a practiced, fluid grace, dodging the strike in a heartbeat before counterattacking. The force of Frieren's magic propelled Zoltraak across the space, resulting in a massive explosion that shook the forest. Yet, as the smoke cleared, Zoltraak manifested multiple mana blasts, which began to detonate throughout the forest in a chaotic, heated barrage. Enclosed in a pocket of scorched earth, Frieren began to gasp heavily. She understood that her current strikes were still too shallow. Solitar's defense magic was overwhelming. Frieren recognized that she could not engage in a brute force battle of mana with a monster like this forever. As Zoltraak walked toward her, she remarked that the battle would ultimately become a war of attrition. Frieren looked up, her expression weary. Zoltraak mentioned that she wanted to inform Frieren of something. Frieren thought to herself that the demon truly spoke too much, a morbid waste of time. But she reasoned that granting the monster a moment to speak would at least give her time to think. Zoltraak explained that she was intimate with mankind's wisdom and bravery, having watched them evolve their magical techniques in concert. She stated she bore no hubris. She knew that one day, mankind would hunt her down. She admitted that she had often imagined herself pleading for her life in tears when that day arrived. Freeren felt a flicker of annoyance, but Zoltraak continued. The demon smiled, telling Frieren that if today were the day of judgment, Frieren should convey the state of her mind. Zoltraak then feigned an apology, claiming she would change her ways because she did not want to die. She merely wished to befriend humans, but simply knew not the means of doing so. Frieren responded that she had already heard such words innumerable times. Zoltraak seemed genuinely surprised, noting that if that were true, then Frieren's mind must be remarkably divergent from mankind. She snarled at Frieren, pointing out that even when beings with human appearances prayed for forgiveness in a human language, Frieren continued to slay them without lending an ear. Zoltraak admitted she could no longer discern which of them was the true monster. Frieren was visibly annoyed, but she used the demon's rambling to finalize a plan. She gradually stood up and noted that this wasn't a conversation at all. Zoltraak was simply reading her like a book. Frieren recognized that Zoltraak understood human psychology better than any demon she had ever encountered, yet they were still tremendously far from coexistence. She compared Zoltraak's actions to someone crowding a caged animal just to observe its reactions. When Zoltraak asked what her state of mind was, Frieren replied that it gave her peace of mind to have a savage demon as an opponent. For once in eons, she could conclude matters without a shred of remorse. The scene shifted back to the Golden City, where Denken was locked in combat with Macht. Our boy Denken was firing multiple bursts of Zoltraak, his movements becoming increasingly accurate as he forced the Sage of Destruction to weave through the air. Macht noticed the shift in precision. He pulled at his own hair, transforming the strands into 3 razor-sharp pins, and flinging them at Denken. Denken tried to dodge, but one of the pins grazed his cheek. He sensed that Macht was predicting more and more of his attacks. As Denken descended to the ground, Macht moved backward, dodging another volley of spells. Macht noted that Denken's way of fighting had altered in such a short time. Macht wondered if Denken was simply remembering his master's movements from their training half a century ago. The tides seemed to turn as Macht dashed through the flames, striking Denken with a heavy, physical force. Macht reasoned that no matter how much Denken improved, the difference in their raw strength remained vast, fathoming that the longer the battle dragged on, the more favorable it becomes for the demon. Denken understood that his great techniques were failing to hit their mark, just as they had 50 years ago. His magic seemed destined never to reach Macht, save for one exception. Suddenly, Macht noticed an attack coming from his side. Before he could react, the spell struck him, utilizing a deceptive angle. Macht stood there, his body wavering from the impact, baffled by the sudden success of the strike. He was bewildered by the speed of the attack and asked what it was. Denken realized the reasoning Frieren had explained to him was holding true. His mind flashed back to their time in the examination dungeon. Frieren had explained to Fern that Zoltraak, ordinary offensive magic, was relatively new to her eyes. As a member of a race that lived since time immemorial, her capacity to reflexively defend against it was not yet instinctive. Even the slightest miscalculation forced her to spend time putting thought into the defense, causing a delay. Back in the present, Denken fired multiple Zoltraaks against Macht. No matter how elevated Macht was, Zoltraak remained a novel magic to him. While it was fundamental for human mages who were born into its era, Macht had been sealed away in Dorado, clueless about the half-century of research mankind had poured into the spell and its counterparts. One of Denken's Zoltraak bolts pierced through Macht's shield, grazing the demon's cheek. Macht looked at the wound, clearly annoyed. He grasped that the magic he was facing was no longer the same as he had once known. Denken told him that this was what was often called ordinary offensive magic, and suggested they settle the matter. Macht smiled. recognizing that his opponent was now the very history of mankind's magic itself. Macht then swiftly transformed his sword back into a coat, which began to twirl and transform into a massive, ornate spear. Macht told Denken that he was indeed his master, but also the enemy that must be defeated. He admitted it had been ages since he had last felt so beguiled by a fight. Denken and Macht stood locked in a tense standoff, their gazes heavy with the history of their shared past. Macht struck his staff against the earth. He spoke with the chilling formality of a sage of destruction, introducing himself as a part of the Demon King's army before signaling the start of his assault. Instantly, the air was filled with a shimmering, synchronized formation of golden shards that moved through the space like shattered glass. Macht dashed forward, unleashing 3 consecutive lunging attacks with a speed that defied his calm demeanor. Denken was swift, though, dodging the strikes by narrow margins as he moved backward. Denken reasoned that this style of combat was unlike anything he had encountered. Macht was exhibiting an infinite mass of gold flakes that carried enough weight to eradicate him with a single direct hit. Seeking an opening, he managed to appear directly behind Macht, unleashing a precise burst of Zoltraak. However, this guy Macht simply adjusted his swarming gold flakes to form an effortless barrier. Denken felt a wave of trouble wash over him as he realized even a surprise attack was failing to connect. The gold flakes surged again. Denken raised his shield to meet the impact. Even so, the shock waves took their toll. Denken found himself on the ground, a trail of blood marking the intensity of the struggle. He forced himself up onto his knees, glaring at Macht while fathoming the gap between them. He understood that, despite only being grazed, his defense magic had been completely pulverized. He wondered what kind of study Macht had devoted his life to in order to reach such an apex of magic. Yet, as Denken pulled a lingering shard from his side, he felt a spark of resolve. He knew he was still alive and capable of fighting. As Macht's attacks began to dash toward him from every direction, Denken rose and began to move with a fluid, graceful rhythm. He recognized that mana detection was too slow to rely on against such speed, so he focused entirely on Macht's preparatory movements. He was sure that, given his training, he could at least manage that. Denken realized that Frieren had placed her trust in him to watch her back, and he vowed to take down the Sage of Destruction. Macht, watching Denken's persistent and fluid movements, noted that the mage truly did not know when to quit. The scene then transitioned to the forest, where the battle between Frieren and Zoltraak continued to rage. Zoltraak laughed, observing that Frieren was keeping her distance, and suggested she was merely buying time. She asked what Frieren was plotting, but the mage offered no verbal reply. Instead, she fired 3 rapid bursts of Zoltraak. Zoltraak dodged the beams with an effortless glide, remarking on how much mankind seemed to adore the killing magic. She spoke of Zoltraak as a superior yet generic offensive spell, noting that its only flaw was how beautifully and logically it had been polished, to the point that even humans could master it. She mentioned that it had become the centerpiece of human magic, and had claimed the most lives in the wars of the southern countries. Zoltraak laughed again, suggesting that even the great elder sage Aureole must be enraptured by its legacy in the depths of hell. When Freeren asked how she knew of Aureole's death, Zoltraak reminded her that she enjoyed conversing with people and had gathered many tales of his downfall. Freeren paused, recognizing the familiar tactics of a demon. She sensed that Zoltraak was trying to induce agitation through her words, knowing that humans naturally try to decipher the meaning behind speech. Freeren admitted to herself that it was infuriating yet effective. Zoltraak was a master of using carefully chosen words to disrupt her opponent's focus. She wondered how many lives the demon had taken to refine such a predatory understanding of human psychology. As Zoltraak continued to dodge, she warned Freeren that simply using Zoltraak would not buy much time. She explained that while demons might be ignorant of some human magic, they were perfectly capable of analyzing the structure of an incantation. She urged Freeren to hurry if she intended to deal with her at all. Brief glimpses showed both battles unfolding simultaneously, Denken struggling against Macht's gold and Freeren trading blows with Zoltraak. Zoltraak maintained her psychological pressure, asserting that Freeren would never be able to reach her. Freeren finally spoke, admitting she had initially believed that to be true, but something had been bugging her, the wound on Zoltraak's shoulder. Instantly, Freeren fired a highly condensed burst of Zoltraak that struck the demon. Freeren deduced that a concentrated attack was the answer. But as the dust settled, she saw Zoltraak standing firm. Zoltraak corrected her, stating that the spell was no longer new to her. She had used a mana shield at the last microsecond to negate the impact. Frieren, floating in the air, recognized the demon's incredible reaction time and realized that if Zoltraak felt the need to block it, the attack was indeed viable. She concluded that she needed to target a gap with even greater speed. Frieren momentarily wished Freeren were there to assist, but the memory of Zoltraak's claim that she had killed the apprentices flared within her. Though she felt a surge of rage, she remained calm, reasoning that the demon had no basis for such an assertion and was likely lying to twist her mind. There was no more time to fret. Frieren smiled, fathoming that if the hero Himmel were there, he would surely believe in his comrades and entrust them to watch his back until the bitter end. She decided that it wouldn't hurt to take a gamble like that herself every so often. The battle between Denken and Macht continued. Denken weaved through the air, his movements precise, as the assault against him grew fiercer by the second, creating a beautiful yet lethal rain that threatened to overwhelm him. Despite the pressure, Denken realized he could still respond to the Sage of Destruction. He observed the demon calmly and was undeniably astonished by his own composure. He recognized that Macht was a mage who existed on a far higher plane than any he had ever known. However, at the same time, a part of Denken felt that Macht had not surpassed the impressions left in his childhood memories. To the young Denken, the adults of his past appeared as giants, and Macht had been a master he believed he would never overcome. Now, as they dueled, Denken fathomed that while he initially thought he had no chance of winning, the gap was not as infinite as it once seemed. In a sudden, sharp movement, one of Denken's Zoltraak attacks managed to scrape Macht's shoulder. Denken sensed that he might actually have the rarest of opportunities, a genuine chance to defeat his master. Macht bent his body low. In that same instant, he extended his spear with a heavy, lunging force. The weapon struck Denken's staff. Macht followed through immediately, with a brutal stab into Denken's belly and a vicious slash. Denken gasped, glaring at Macht as he began to descend toward the ground, blood beginning to pool on the earth before him. This guy was a monster, after all. Denken struggled to speak, his voice weak as he mentioned that, at the very least, he had wanted to bring the fight to a draw. Macht glared down at him in silence. He reasoned that Denken was likely barely able to speak, yet he recognized that the man had not yet lost his will to fight. Unfortunately, Macht said, this is now the end for you. The scene shifted back to the forest where Frieren and Zoltraak were engaged in their own lethal dance. Freeren had taken on an even more serious demeanor. Suddenly, a colossal gust of mana enveloped the entire forest, surging outward with enough force to send birds into a panicked flight. With the golden curse lifted, the city's inhabitants awakened in confusion. Shimmering golden petals, once frozen in form, now drift through the air across the entire expanse. Denken and Macht paused, looking around at the strange energy. Macht wondered what was happening, fathoming that Frieren was behind it. Before his thoughts could settle, a beam of Zoltraak struck him squarely in the chest. Denken had used the distraction to fire a highly condensed shot. Macht was shocked, placing a hand over the hole that now pierced his torso. He concluded that it was absurd. He didn't believe he had let his guard down. He asked why Denken had waited until now to use a spell of such might. A real trump card should only be used once you have ascertained the possibility of victory, Denken said. He reminded Macht that this was a lesson his master had once taught him. Denken noted that they had finally reached a draw. Back in the forest, Frieren addressed Zoltraak. She stated that she was finished with her analysis. The strange energy that had rushed through the world was Frieren canceling out the curse of Dorado. Zoltraak was genuinely surprised. She understood then that Frieren had continued to analyze the nature of Dorado even while they were locked in a life-or-death struggle. She asked why Frieren would prioritize the city when it could affect the battle at hand. She paused, a realization dawning on her, but Frieren simply told her it was too late. Suddenly, a massive, long-range bolt of Zoltraak tore through the air from a great distance, striking Zoltraak directly in the chest. Frieren turned her gaze toward the direction of the shot, noting with a quiet pride that Freeren had done well. As Freeren began to descend from the sky, Stark appeared in a flash. He caught her as she fell, and asked if she was all right. Freeren mentioned that she had completely run out of mana. Zoltraak lay on the ground, looking pitiful as the life began to drain from her. She recognized that it was a super-large, long-range shot from beyond her mana detection range. She admitted it was unexpected and magnificent. Frieren, despite her exhaustion, pointed her staff toward the fallen demon, preparing a final shot. In that moment, Frieren's mind drifted back to a memory of her old party. They had been attacking the demon known as the Immortal Bows. The party had mercilessly dismantled his defenses. As the demon's body began to disappear, Himmel had told him that his greatest miscalculation was looking down on humans. He warned him never to make light of humanity again. Back in the present, Solitär began to laugh. She mentioned that committing such an irredeemable oversight was fascinating, especially considering how demonic an ending it was. Freeren asked if she was going to beg for mercy. Solitär smiled and asked if that was what Frieren wanted to hear. No, Frieren said. She instantly fired the Zoltraak she had been preparing, and Solitär's body began to wither away as Frieren laid waste to the remainder of her form. Floating quietly in the aftermath, Frieren looked toward the city. She sensed the energy from over there, and concluded that Denken and Macht had reached their own conclusion. The scene shifted with a heavy finality back to Denken and Macht. As the Sage of Destruction stood unsteadily, Denken spoke with a weary breath, telling his master that they had finally reached a draw. Denken's body began to fail as he fell limp toward the earth. Macht forced himself to move, crawling toward a nearby wall where he rested a trembling hand to hold himself upright. He fathomed that he had to turn the situation around, knowing that Frieren was still alive and the threat remained. He tried to walk away, his movements slow and pained. When he finally reached the heart of the city, he recognized a sight he hadn't seen in half a century. The people he had turned to gold were walking around, appearing as though no time had passed at all. In their eyes, Macht was still the benefactor of the city. One of the citizens called out to him in concern, asking just what in the world had happened to cause such a grievous wound. Macht managed to tell them that he was all right as he continued his slow trek past them. As he moved, he sensed that Solitär was dead, and a cold, sharp anger began to rise within him. His mind drifted back to the memories they shared, sitting together at a fountain. He remembered how she had walked off, eager to begin their experiment, but he had asked her to wait. He had been intrigued, asking why she was helping him if she truly believed that coexistence was nothing more than a wild story. Solitär had smiled, explaining that she simply thought she could get him to reconsider his path. She had mentioned that, although Macht seemed to loathe him, the Great Demon King had possessed a similar belief, a desire for coexistence that had ultimately resulted in a great war with mankind. She noted that there was nothing enjoyable about such a result. Unlike conversing or experimenting with humans, war was unperceivable and unproductive. Most importantly, she noted with a quiet gravity, all of their friends had died. She had warned Macht that the idea of coexistence was dangerous, and that just a little longer would have seen the demons exterminated by mankind. When Macht challenged her to kill him if that was her argument, she had simply smiled. She admitted that she had considered him a friend, even though she could not stop the Demon King. She confessed that she had originally come with the intention to kill him, but she was afraid of the battle. She was not eccentric enough to risk her own life just to extend the existence of their race. No matter how heretic or abnormal it seemed, she had smiled and reminded him that they were still demons in the end. Though their forms differed, they possessed demonic qualities they could never escape. She felt that as long as Macht understood that, it was sufficient. In the present, Macht stopped responding to the world around him, his mind focused on his pitiful state and the hole in his chest. This guy was finally feeling the weight of his nature. He wondered at how unsightly demons truly were. Ever since he had donned the stone bracelet of sovereignty, he never believed he would feel the fear of death. As he walked, he wondered if he could have ever acquired unknown emotions or achieved true coexistence in punishment. He had once thought that death would be welcome, and yet he found himself valuing his life more than ever, trying to escape in an unsightly manner just like any other demon. He realized something severe. His mana was seeping away, and he was past the point of any return. He wondered where he was even trying to escape to. Suddenly, he arrived at an open space where Gluck stood waiting. Gluck glared at him, calling out his name. Macht bent toward the ground, and Gluck asked about the nature of his wound. Macht smiled, mentioning that it seemed the time for his punishment had finally come. Gluck nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. The two men rested against a wall and began to converse. Gluck lit a cigarette, placing it in his mouth before showing the rest of the pack to Macht, asking if he wanted one too. Macht nodded, and Gluck bent over to place the cigarette in the demon's mouth. They shared what would be their last smoke together. Macht admitted to Gluck that, in the end, he still had not comprehended a single thing about human emotions. Gluck stood silent for a moment before offering a sincere apology. He told Macht that although he had promised to accompany him to the depths of hell until he found the emotions he sought, he had been genuine with those words. Macht simply replied that he knew. In that moment, our boy Denken walked into the space. Looking very old and frail, he approached the two men. Macht glared at him, remarking that Denken truly was not one to give up. Gluck looked at the mage, realizing it was indeed Denken. Macht, in a final act of demonic defiance, warned Denken not to come any closer, or he would kill Gluck. Gluck called Macht a partner in crime, noting that he truly was beyond the point of redemption. This caused Macht to smile. Gluck grabbed onto the demon's shoulder, looked at Denken and asked him to put Macht out of his misery. Denken unleashed his Zoltraak, and in an instant, Macht was gone, leaving only ashes on the ground. Soldiers rushed into the space, shouting in confusion, but Gluck commanded them to take Denken to the church and keep him alive. He declared Denken the hero who had saved Weise. As the ashes of Macht's body flowed away in the wind, only the stone bracelet remained on the ground. Gluck stood there, looking at the spot where his friend and partner in crime had vanished. He whispered that they had shared a wonderful time, a truly wonderful time. He knew that every good thing had to see an end, and this was the final end for Macht of El Dorado, the strongest of the 7 great demons. Following the monumental events that had transpired at the great city of Weise, the quiet sanctuary of the church became a place of recovery. Denken sat upright in a bed assigned to him for healing. Denken asked where exactly he was, to which the man replied that this was the Weise church. Denken fathomed the weight of the situation before inquiring how long he had been asleep. Upon learning it had been 3 days, he let out a quiet breath of acknowledgement. The man mentioned he would summon Gluck now and exited the room. Left alone, Denken looked out the window, watching the citizens go about their normal, mundane tasks. He realized then that he was truly victorious, and finally back in Weise. The realization was incredibly soothing for him. After some time had passed, Gluck walked into the space where Denken lay. Denken called out to him, addressing him as father-in-law. Gluck pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, mentioning that Freeren had already told him the entire story. He noted that while he had told Denken to stop by home once in a while, he never imagined it would take half a century. Gluck praised Denken, stating that he had done a fine job saving Weise. Denken paused, remarking that the feat was not done by one man alone. Gluck agreed, noting that Denken had been blessed with wonderful companions. The focus shifted to Stark and Fern in their own quarters as they nursed their health. Stark was already brimming with energy, performing press-ups on the floor. He noted that his condition had improved considerably. Freeren and Fern glared at him from their seats. Stark asked if they were going to call him a monster again, explaining that he had only been shattered into pieces this time, so it wasn't a life-threatening injury. He claimed this sort of thing was normal for a warrior. Fern whispered something to Frieren, which caused Stark to scream, demanding they stop giving him the most hurtful reactions he had ever seen. Frieren sat there wondering, fathoming that such resilience wasn't actually normal for a warrior at all. She reasoned that if it were Eisen, he would have been doing squats while carrying a massive boulder the day after such an injury, meaning Stark was actually a bit slower and not quite a refined warrior yet. Fern mentioned that she too felt genuinely shocked seeing Stark heal so quickly, noting that even Hyder would have been stunned by the situation. Freeren stood up, suggesting that since Stark was able to move again, he should help her with the shopping the next day. Stark accepted the task. Fern, however, mentioned that she still required more time to recuperate. Frieren sat back down, saying there was no need to rush and that she was thankful they could finally take it easy. She told Fern that half a century ago, this town sold popular grimoires and magical items. She revealed she had found a darkness dragon horn, a precious material she believed was no longer obtainable. While Freeren was happy, Fern grew angry, sensing Freeren was squandering their money again. Stark looked at the horn, noting its insanely dark aura and asking if it was harmful to the body. Freeren admitted she had no idea, which thoroughly annoyed Stark. Walking toward the door, Freeren told them to take their time healing. She mentioned that thanks to the feudal lord, the town was in a welcoming mood. She looked back and told the two of them that they had done well, admitting she wouldn't have stood a chance if they hadn't been there for her. Stark laughed, admitting he had been scared to death, while Fern noted she felt like a walking corpse. The following days were filled with mundane activities. Frieren visited the market to pick out fruits and spent hours in magic shops selecting grimoires. Stark continued his training in the hospital while Fern slowly recovered. Once Fern was well, she joined Stark for long walks around Weise, chatting and sharing meals. Frieren showed Fern all the treasures she had acquired during their stay. Eventually, the party gathered at the church to visit Denken one last time. It was time for them to depart. Frieren smiled at Denken, and the old mage stood up to shake her hand, expressing his deep appreciation for everything she had done. The scene then moved to Gluck's mansion. Frieren appeared in his office, and Gluck asked if they were already leaving. Frieren confirmed they were, stating they had rested their wings there long enough. Gluck noted it was good timing. In a few days, the town would become hectic when the envoy from the royal capital arrived to investigate the wicked acts of the nobles. Gluck admitted he was one of those nobles, yet Frieren observed that he seemed strangely happy despite that. Gluck explained that he had made a request to Denken long ago, when the mage was much younger, for him to become a great imperial mage who could influence the country. He felt that the time for justice had finally come, and he had never been happier. As a parting word, he thanked Frieren for fighting by Denken's side and saving the city. Frieren seemed surprised by his gratitude. Gluck noticed her expression and asked if she had witnessed Macht's memories. He stated he had no intention of resenting the demon's death. That scoundrel had finally scattered into oblivion. He realized that if Frieren had not restored Weise from its golden state, that end would never have come to fruition, likely resulting in a far more tragic conclusion. He assured her his gratitude was not a lie. Gluck offered to send them off and suggested calling Denken, but Frieren declined, mentioning they had already said their farewells. She reasoned it wasn't good to intrude while Denken was visiting a grave. At the gravesite of Lecture, Denken's deceased wife, the old mage stood in quiet contemplation. He called out her name softly, admitting that until the very end, his life had been an unsightly struggle. He remembered the warmth of their beautiful memories, their youth, their first ball, and the picnics they shared, before the sad news of her failing health had changed everything. He stood there to commemorate it all, finally at peace. With their tasks complete, Gluck watched as Frieren and her party walked away from the city of Weise. Having done a world of good, they set out on their next journey, moving toward the unknown adventures awaiting them on the road to Aureole. That's a wrap, champ. Thanks for watching. If you got to the end, maybe type "Stark needs more lines" in the comment section. Also, feel free to check out other videos on the channel. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.